This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Are we having fun yet?
Yes, we are, Don. Yes, we are. And tonight, we're going to be talking about American comic books. Yes, we're finally getting around to the American comics, folks. We hit Japan first because we're a couple of Japanophiles, but I guess it's time for us to mosey on back to the homeland, well, North America anyway, and talk about American comics, which Don and I, of course, both grew up with, being a couple of good Canadian kids, and because there were no good Canadian comics for us to read.
I actually grew up with a lot of European stuff, but okay.
Okay, well, there's that too. Oh, still no good Canadian comics for us to read. Sorry, Captain Canuck.
That's not nice.
I know. Actually, I think there is a book in the library. I remember seeing about Canadian comics. I think there is an actual book about them, but they just never really took off.
That book is probably the one written by Clive Smith, the guy from headed up Nelvana.
Yes, it is, I think, actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I do vaguely remember that. Yeah, I think it is. I haven't read it in a long time, because that was an old book.
Yeah, it was early 70s.
Yep, that's the one I'm thinking of, because it has a lot of time, because it spends a lot of time on Captain Canuck, of course, and was it Nelvana? Is that
Nelvana of the Ether People.
Yeah, Nelvana of the Ether People.
Yep.
Hear that, folks? We Canadians have really messed up comics.
And they talk about Bell. Bell was kind of the, back in like the golden age, Bell was kind of like the Canadian comic book publisher.
I vaguely know about them, but, maybe we should see if we can find a scholar on Canadian comics at some point and actually talk about them. I think that would be awesome.
Mm-hmm. We could, because it's funny when you go through that and you find out the history of Canadian comic books. Mm-hmm. I'm actually related to a Canadian comic book character.
You are? Superman?
No.
Okay, which one?
No. They did a book, and it was kind of like a biography on Angus MacAskill, who's the Cape Breton giant.
Right.
And they did comic stories of some of his stuff, and he's like a distant cousin of mine.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So, if he was the giant of Cape Breton, why are you so short?
Well, you've met my family. All my family are little tiny people.
Tiny, but stocky and tough. Yes, yeah, that's definitely true. Enough about Canadian comics. Let's talk about American comics. So, Don, I suppose we should probably do this chronologically. So, but before we want to begin, I guess there's two things we should cover. First, I think you had a disclaimer, and then we're going to talk about how exactly we're going to divide up the different periods of comic books, because I think we should get that out of the way right at the beginning.
Yes.
So, okay, disclaimer time. Go.
Yeah, there's kind of two things to remember, especially if you've... I'm going to compare this a lot to our episodes on the Japanese comic industry. One thing with the American comic industry that happens is, whereas the Japanese one worked in waves, that you'd have somebody would do something, everybody would do that would be the big thing, but there'd be this undercurrent of almost the opposite. And then at some point, interest in the main thing would wane, and that other thing that was the opposite would move into the foreground. American comic books kind of go event to event to event.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the events are something outside of the industry as well. It has nothing to do with comic books, but something will happen, and then that defines what everybody does.
Right.
And the other thing to keep in mind, because of that, what ends up happening just after World War II, American comic books have a mainstream, which means that there's kind of one rabbit that everybody is chasing. Now, there's other stuff that's going on, and this is kind of the second part of the disclaimer I think we should put out there. There's other things going on, but they never reach the scope that the mainstream stuff does.
Definitely.
So like people our age might remember like the black and white boom of the early 80s. And there were companies that they got a lot of press, they got a lot of popularity for independent comic books, but they never reached like the numbers that say your Marvel or your DC or your Archie or that hit.
Definitely,
with a few exceptions, like the Ninja Turtles took off, but the Ninja Turtles wasn't straying too far from the mainstream adolescent male superhero kind of formula.
It very much wasn't, yeah.
And there's a catch to that too when we get to that era as well. But that's a thing to remember, and because of that, there's a lot of stuff I don't think we're going to talk about. And I don't mean that like anybody listening, anything we leave out, this I don't want to say background stuff, but your alternative stuff, it's not because it's not important, and it's not because it's not worthwhile. It's because you've got this giant machine of a mainstream comic book industry that kind of squeezes stuff out.
Yep, that's very true.
So even if we get to the undergrounds, we're probably not going to do a lot on like the undergrounds or the independents. It's part of the formula. It adds to it. But it's not, it's dwarfed by this giant monolithic mainstream. And a lot of that story's unto itself. Like if you've heard our episodes with Jeff and Ed, they worked in the independent branch of the comic industry. And there's a whole ton of stuff going on. But it never quite hits that proportion that this indomitable mass that, was mainstream comics was.
Does that mean we're not going to talk about Cherry Pop-Tart?
Again, that works its way into a lot of our episodes.
Cherry's awesome. Oh, wait. I mean, I've heard it's awesome. I've never read it, of course. That would be wrong. And way before my time, I think, maybe. Anyway, all right. So neither here nor there. All right. So,
okay.
So in that case, okay. So the other thing, as I said, we should probably get out of the way is what exactly the comic eras we're going to be working with are, because there's some standard definitions, and then I know, Don, you have your own definitions of exactly where the eras break up. I mean, people use medals to describe the different comic ages. The general comic historian version runs like this. The first period is called the Golden Age, and it runs till about 1954. Some people say it starts with the first appearance of Superman in 1938. Some people say it starts a little earlier, but it generally runs until 54 because that's when we have the Senate subcommittee, which we'll talk about in a bit. Then after that, we've got basically the Silver Age from 56 to sometime in the 70s is generally considered to be that period. Then the Bronze Age from sometime in the 70s until 86, when The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen get published and everyone loses their minds over dark Batman stuff. And suddenly we enter the Dark Age of comics. Oh, sorry, I mean the modern age of comics, which some people will say goes till today. But there are a lot of people who say that's not exactly correct anymore, that we've gone through a couple periods since then. How do you say, Don? How say you?
Okay, and this is another one of those things I think when we divide it up into eras, it's mostly just to corral certain ideas so that they're easier to study. Anybody out there, try not to get, like I say, too wrapped around the axle about the specifics. It's more to facilitate looking at what's actually going on. To that end, I kind of go by the standard. And you got to remember the standard kind of changed in the 80s, because when you got to the 1980s, that's when people sort of started taking comic books seriously. And you ended up with a lot of industry analysis, and they needed some way to gauge things. There was a tendency for a lot of people to have who commented on the industry, to have their heads so far up their own ass they needed like an orthodontist to have their prostate checked. Things like that. So it gets, there's all kinds of weird things, but I usually go I go pre-comic book.
Mm-hmm.
I go Golden Age.
Mm-hmm.
I go Silver Age,
Mm-hmm.
Bronze Age, Modern Age, which was like 30 years ago, but that's what they called it back then. Postmodern, postmodern, because I can't think of a better term, and current.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the way I see it is each era, it works kind of like when we talked about the history of role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
The first half and the second half of each era are different, but you'll see how when I get into it, I divide things the way I do because there's one kind of idea that unifies that, and then something different happens to it during the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And there's a transition. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so we might as well get started then. So, as far as we know, the very, very first comic published in the United States was The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck.
Mm-hmm.
In 1842, which was actually a pirated copy of what is it? The Loves of Monsieur Dubois, by Randolph Toppler, and it was done without Toppler's authorization. So it truly was a bunch of public bootleg comic books that were very popular. This is 1842 we're talking here, and then they were reprinted on a regular basis, with Toppler probably not getting an actual penny. But it was popular enough that in 1849 there was a probably rip-off of it or something to that effect called Journey to the Gold Diggins by Jeremiah Sandbags. And this was by James A. and Donald F. Reed. And this is generally considered the very first American comic to come out. Now, when we say comic, we don't mean comic book. This, of course, is probably something closer to a comic strip in form. And back then, they usually were pictures with captions, as opposed to an actual word balloons or comic dynamic as we understand them anyway.
Yeah, there's kind of a couple of I think you can go back a little bit further.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, without losing the thread. A lot of people say the origin of comic books proper goes to 1734.
Oh, okay.
And that was William Hogarth's A Harlot's Progress.
Mm-hmm.
He did that. Yeah. And then next year he did A Rake's Progress. And they weren't exactly comic books. They weren't comic strips. They were a series. I think there was 6 illustrations for each. Mm-hmm. And what they did is you viewed them in a certain order and it kind of told a story.
Yes.
And that was and that's why I say it's kind of the origin. It puts that idea of pictures in sequence to tell a story. And it plays upon that notion of completion. Mm-hmm. That idea that the actual story is happening entirely in your brain. The pictures are sort of suggesting where it goes.
Right.
And that's the basis of what a comic book is.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah. A couple years later, you get Wilhelm Busch. Mm-hmm. 1865 does a series called Max und Moritz, which, again, people consider the beginnings of comic books, but it's closer to, I don't know the technical term. I refer to it as illustrated story. Mm-hmm. If you remember, the old Babar books, or Rupert the Bear, that it would be a picture, and there'd be pictures in sequence, but there'd be no captions or word balloons. It would be the narrative, like you'd write prose, like you'd write a story, underneath each picture.
Right, yeah.
Describing dialogue and action.
Right, well, children's books, sometimes even still today, use that formula.
Yep. And that, again, takes that idea of pictures in sequence, but now it adds narrative to it. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to get closer to the idea of comic book. And that's the era of what you were talking about.
Yes, The Loves of Monsieur Dubois. But that would be 1842, so that would still predate. And apparently it was very popular, actually. That would still predate what you're talking about. But again, they're both threads on the same line.
Yep, and the other thing that's important is that idea of collecting them. That back in the mid to late 1800s, that was really popular. Essentially what they were was tankobon.
Yeah, pretty much.
And we had that here too. Anybody who, say, our age might remember going to the bookstore and you get a paperback, but it would be a collection of Wizard of Id or BC or Garfield or whatever.
Yep, I had a bunch of those.
That's kind of the same idea. That's That's what these books were.
Mm-hmm.
It was these stories, these illustrated stories in book form. And again, it's not quite a comic book, but it's edging us closer towards that idea.
Right. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And as it would continue on, of course, eventually this would be influenced heavily by the rise of the, originally magazine strip and eventually newspaper strips that would appear.
Yeah.
With the most famous eventually being Hogan's Alley by Richard F. I can never figure out how to pronounce his name. It's Outcult, I guess.
Yeah.
It's Outcault. Yeah, Outcult? Occult? Yeah. Richard Occult? Maybe it should be Occult. I don't know. It's Outcult I'm going to go with anyway.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, pretty much. And he basically began creating these characters in 1894. And in the New York World, they first appeared. He'd originally created them for Truth magazine, but eventually that. And originally they were these full-page drawings of all these, like, basically street urchins having hilarious shenanigans and doing things. And it was kind of like one of those Family Circus cartoons. No, not Family Circus. What? Oh, Family Circle cartoons. Wasn't it Family Circle?
Family Circus.
It was Family Circus. Okay, it's been a while. It was like one of those Family Circus cartoons where you follow the kid through like all this maze of jumping over fences and going through houses and all this stuff that we used to get when we were kids. Mm-hmm. Well, it's basically kind of like one of those, except they're street urchins who are starving to death and having hijinks in Hogan's Alley.
Yeah.
And one of these lovable little street urchins would soon be known as the Yellow Kid, which was actually named after his shirt because he wore a yellow nightgown. And
he was a bald kid in this like full length shirt.
Yep, who looks horribly and stereotypically Asian, but is actually supposed to be Irish.
Yeah. He looks Asian depending on how he's drawn and how well it's reproduced. Like if you see high quality reproductions of a lot of stuff, he's this really generic. Well, he's a Homo sapien, but I'm not sure of the exact species kind of thing.
Yeah, he actually kind of in a lot of pictures he looks almost more like a monkey. He's got these giant ears.
He's this. If you've seen him and you know what he looks like, he becomes the stereotypical goofy kid.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like the kid with the big ears and like the goofy grin and stuff.
Yep, that would be him.
Yeah,
and he actually became so popular that he was basically the very first that we know of anyway comic book mascot craze kid, basically. I mean, he literally sold so many papers that the New York World fought a war over him with William Randolph Hearst.
Yeah.
And was it
the American Humorist is what you're getting.
Yeah, the American Humorist. There we go. Who had the rival paper, the New York Journal, and he managed to entice Outcult away to work for the New York Journal, stealing him from the New York World, and it caused all sorts of problems.
Yeah, there's an extra kind of, I don't know if it's a step, but an extra circumstance there, because the World was run by Joseph Pulitzer.
Yes,
and he came up with the idea of the Sunday supplement. And the World was the first. The World was the first one that did that. And the idea was, it had more illustrations, it had color. That's where the comics really came in, and that was why Occult could do these big full page things, because it was to sell the Sunday supplement.
Right.
William Randolph Hearst, the American Humorist, was kind of his version,
right, of
the Sunday supplement, and he had he again. They brought in different cartoonists. He got Outcult from them. They also did the Katzenjammer Kids.
Right. Yeah.
And
they would have. Okay.
And we're going back to this is 1897. 1895 was the Yellow Kid. These are important because American comic books and newspaper strips have a common origin, but they go different places in a hurry.
Yes, they do.
This is their common origin. One of the things that the Yellow Kid did is, on his giant shirt, what he was thinking or saying would be written on it.
Basically his word balloon, pretty much.
Yeah. The Katzenjammer Kids is kind of the first comic strip that you would look at and go, that's a comic strip. It's laid out like a comic. It's got word balloons, which word balloons people have been kind of experimenting with before.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever seen like an old-timey like 1800s comic, though, they're these weird cramped little things and they go at strange angles.
Right.
Because they sort of just squeeze it in and they're hard to read. And I can only imagine with the printing techniques of the day, these were probably impossible to read.
Pretty much, yeah. They would have been so fuzzy.
Yeah, but the Cats and Jammer Kids is kind of the first one that they were, I guess, legible. I guess, and that's why they're considered the original comic
Well, they had
strip.
better printing techniques at that point.
Yeah. But when you see them too, they're laid out different. They're laid out what we'd call they're simple, but they're clean.
Right, that's true.
And that's again a big part of it. When you look at like Occult, or everybody's seen from the late 1800s, you've seen political comics that they're all these like wood grain, scratchy, super fussy, cross-hatched things.
That's true. Yeah, and they look really weird. But that's, again, printing techniques. It all came to... they were... Oh, geez. I'm trying to remember what point that they actually developed the ability to actually put pictures into newspapers and such. But it was actually relatively recent, so to speak. I mean, they had newspapers for like almost 200 years before they could actually put real pictures in them. Prior to that, they could put woodblock paintings and such in them and stamps. But they couldn't put actual pictures for a very long time.
Yeah.
So at this point, there weren't a lot of different kinds of media. So people basically were reading novels. Radio wasn't popular until like the 1920s. Movies started around this time, actually. People were getting the very first films, but they were not the popular films we know of today. They were almost more experimental at this point. Yeah, they would eventually...
Films, too, like, people don't realize the earliest movies are only like 10 minutes long.
Oh, if that. The first full-length film, which is 90 minutes, wouldn't come until, I believe it's 1915 or 1916 with... do you know what movie that is?
The first feature-length?
The first feature-length film, yep. I believe it's 1916.
Oh, Birth of a Nation.
It is Birth of a Nation, of course. The great KKK recruiting film. And oddly relevant in our times.
Fantastic. So film was used for evil right from the beginning.
Pretty much, yeah. Actually. Yeah, pretty much. All right, so Birth of a Nation. So anyway, right up until the 20s and such, comics were this popular but kind of novel form that mostly just existed as newspaper strips. That's pretty much what they were. They were just newspaper strips, or what we would call newspaper strips today. There weren't a lot of major ones. I mean, the only major development was that they started doing collections, as you said, and also the Sunday papers started having these supplements that were longer and longer, where they were filled with all these full-page comic book strips and such that were continuing on stuff from the weeklies, basically. It was basically a gimmick to sell Sunday papers because they knew the kids loved them, and also they knew people wouldn't usually buy Sunday papers otherwise. It was just basically a gimmick for selling them, an extra kind of bonus.
Yeah.
This would, of course, continue until 1929 with the Funnies.
Oh, I think there's a couple of steps in between.
Okay, go.
One thing that I would mention, and I know we've talked about them before, when you're going from comic strip to comic book, you have to think of Winsor McCay.
Okay.
He did Little Nemo in Slumberland.
Yes, he did.
And that starts like 1905. Those are, I think, the first time you see something that would look you'd say was a comic book page. Because he would do these big full page layouts, and the layout of the page would affect the story. Yeah. And that was kind of the first time people really started doing that.
Yes.
And like I said,
Sorry, I was just going to say, the Little Nemos, even people today, if you were to look at a Little Nemo comic, you would recognize it as a comic book by today's standards, or at least a comic strip anyway. You would probably think it came out in the early 70s. Yeah, you probably would, actually. I'm not sure why, but the way he did his inking and the trippy layouts and the trippy font he used for his titles and stuff, it looks very 1970s. Yeah, that's true, even though it's from right at the beginning of the 20th century. That's true. Yep. Yeah, because his first one was, what was it, Tales of a Rarebit Fiend? Yeah, that sounds familiar.
That's like his first known work, but it was the Little Nemo that, if you want to talk comic books, that's where you start seeing that comic book aesthetic.
Right. Yeah.
And then what you end up with, what you were getting at, the first comic book, technically, was it was a small pamphlet. It was Funnies on Parade,
right,
in 1933, which was done. It was like a promotion for Procter and Gamble.
Yes, it was. Yeah, for their soaps and toiletry products.
Yeah.
Yep, that's very true. It was actually the idea of a guy named Maxwell Gaines.
Yep.
Also, but he wasn't the only guy. There was also Harry L. Weidenberg and George Janosik. And they were a Waterbury, Connecticut company, Eastern Color Printing. And this was their idea as an extra little thing for sending stuff out as a promotion. They ended up printing 10,000 copies, and it was such a success that they produced similar periodicals for Canada Dry Soft Drinks, Kinney Shoes, Whitney Cereal, and others, with print runs of 100,000 to 250,000.
Yeah.
Because they were popular.
Yeah, and they were also they were reprints of comics from the paper. Yeah,
they weren't new material at all. They were totally reprints, which I guess they kind of sort of had the license to use, probably.
Yeah, they would. It's one of those things, too, that people would sort of not be real fussy on, because people are just starting to realize the idea we can monetize this stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, again, they're being given away for free.
Yeah.
At this point, it's just a little extra. Doesn't matter. Okay, so Eastern Color did actually publish its own famous funnies in July 1934, which is a 68-page giant, which sold for a whole 10 cents.
Yep.
And this was a huge success. Okay? And the listeners absolutely loved it, and it sold 90% of its 200,000 print. And
it's considered the first comic book proper.
Pretty much, yeah.
Even though it's reprints.
Yep, pretty much. And it would eventually run 218 issues. Even though really it's just reprints. Again, we're not looking at actual new material here.
Yeah. Until
we get to, Don, you do the honors.
Yep, 1935, you get New Fun Comics.
Right.
Which was originally called New Fun, which was New Fun, the big comic magazine. It was published by National Allied Publications.
That name doesn't sound very familiar, Don. Is there another name we can call them?
Yes, they also, back in the 70s, became National Periodical Publications.
And something else?
And eventually they were bought by Warner.
And turned into?
DC Comics.
Yeah, exactly.
Dun dun. Yeah, so that goes way back. And More Fun was the first appearance of new material for a comic book.
Exactly. It featured a mix of humor features, including the funny animal comic, Pellian and Ossa, the college set Jigger and Ginger. These sound like I'm talking. These sound like furry porn comics. But anyway, the dramatic Western strip, Jack Woods. Jack Woods, Jeff Woods. I sense a connection.
Dun, dun.
And the Yellow Peril adventure, Barry O'Neill, which starred a Fu Manchu-style villain named Fang Gao. And then in issue number 6, okay, these two like kids from Canada, well, at least with Canadian connections, named Jerry Siegel and Joe Schuster, began with the musketeer swashbuckler, a guy named Henry Duval.
I think it's pronounced Henri Duval.
Henri Duval. We'll go with that, French boy. All right. And so doing 2 installments before turning it over to others under the pseudonyms Ledger and Roos. They also created the supernatural crime fighter adventure Dr. Occult. Oh, which I believe Dr. Occult is still running around in the DC universe today.
Yeah, he kind of disappeared for a bit, but back in the 90s with the Vertigo line, they brought him back as like one of their main guys. He showed up in Crisis.
Yeah, I remember Dr. Occult. He's got this weird mandala symbol thingy he runs around with and sticks it in monsters' faces.
Yeah, and he looks like at least at this time, he looked like a generic like pulp hero.
Yes, yeah, he would have.
he gets a weird costume like years later, but for the most part, he's just like a square-jawed guy in a trench coat.
I think he is still today, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
I think they gave him a mask later on, but for the most part, I think he's mostly just a guy with a hat and a trench coat.
Yeah, because in the Vertigo era, every character was a guy with a hat and a trench coat.
Well, yes, they were. Yes, they were. So Dr. Occult, which... Wouldn't that mean that Dr. Occult... Well, I guess he's not technically the first superhero. I mean, he does kind of have powers, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
He was created by Siegel and Schuster. But, that's an interesting question. But I guess he's not considered the first superhero, not the proper one anyway. Because again, he's not wearing a costume.
Yeah, see, this is where I think the idea of not being too fussy about the hair splitting is important. Because I have seen a lot of... places that do say Dr. Occult is technically the first superhero. I think they give him correct credence because he becomes part of DC's superhero catalog like years later.
Yeah. So, okay. Although, who would you consider the first superhero, Don?
Well, this gets into, like, I would probably say that More Fun Comics is the beginning of the Golden Age.
Right, okay, makes sense.
Because I think this is the official beginning of the comic book. It sets the template, because if you look, a lot of the stories that they're doing are borrowing from, like, the pulps and the adventure stories from, like, a few years earlier. So
right.
That's where you get, like, the tough guy, like what we call the Indiana Jones type nowadays becomes popular.
Right.
The two-fisted detective becomes popular. Even early superheroes, the earliest predominant version would be like the Dr. Occult Man of Mystery, which is, like the Shadow kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that comes from the pulps. The first superhero proper, I think, would be 1938 Superman.
Yep, definitely. I agree with that. Well, he's also the first one to dress in a true costume.
Yeah, and some of the other guys did, but again, it would be, I change into my blue jacket with mask.
Well,
it's
yeah, okay, yeah, it's true. Yeah,
but he set the template. He's got the cape.
Mm-hmm.
He's got the long johns. He's the weird history kind of thing. He's got stuff that would recognize as superpowers.
Mm-hmm.
But again, because if you read early superhero comics, they're not like when I was a kid. You're talking coming out of the 60s, where like Superman could like move the sun if he wanted to, kind of thing.
Right.
The earliest characters, because they're pulp heroes, a lot of their powers were more like a gimmick.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Like even Superman, he was bulletproof. He could jump over tall buildings and stuff. Like, and this was kind of the extent of it.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Well, keep in mind, a lot of this early stuff, they were basically just, it was a gimmick, as you said. They're still basically crime-busting pulp heroes, which is what were popular at that time.
Yeah.
And yeah, they have a gimmick, but they're still ultimately doing the same thing all the other crime-busting pulp heroes are.
Yeah, like even the first Superman stories, he's basically like busting gangsters and stuff.
Yeah, exactly, which Superman later on wouldn't even bother with. I mean, that's that's someone else's job. It's not worth his time. He's got to save the planet.
Yep.
Actually, fun thing, Action Comics #1, which has Superman on the cover, he's actually the backup story. He's not even the actual main story in that.
Yeah, because you saw that too. Like if you've read Action Comics #1, and these days on the internet you can, there was that idea, and this is why I say he's the first superhero, because you could tell they were nervous about putting him in, because even though we'd consider him like a street level superhero nowadays.
Right.
At the time, he was something weird and mystical and fantastic, and there was this fear that the public couldn't handle something that over the top, to the point that there are little scientific factoids in the first Superman comic. So
right.
he lifts like a car, and there's a little panel that says the ant can lift 100 times his own body weight, and that's like real. So Superman isn't crazy, right, kids?
Yeah, that's true. They're actually trying to explain it. I'd forgotten about that. You're right.
And I think part of that, too, is because at this time, coming out of the pulp era, comic books weren't strictly kids stuff. They might have been considered a little lowbrow. They were considered like, pop culture, mass entertainment. But they were still, they figured a significant portion of their readership would be older, would be, say, like old like late teens, even grown-ups. And that was where I think that fear came from, that they thought that, you know, a grown-up wouldn't believe, oh, he jumps over a building, that's just crazy. Nobody can do that.
Well, they assumed that, yeah, they were a general audience thing.
Yeah.
For the most part.
You could get away with a Dr. Occult because, again, coming from that pulp tradition, and remember at this point, xenophobia was still a thing. That was quite popular and open. And the idea was that, well, there is stuff like hypnotism and mysticism and that, because those guys over in that Asia place, they do all that, right? And that's a thing, isn't it? So, and that's where I think you get that idea, like I said, Superman being the first superhero, because he was really pushing audience credulity at the time.
Yeah. I can see that. I can definitely see that. Although, as far as your comment about that, well, let's see. Okay, so let's see. So Superman hits in 38. We'll get to more about that in a second. And 39, National Comics publication, the true DC Comics, because DC Comics is actually an amalgam of several different companies. Yeah. But National is the true DC Comics in a sense, the one that has the direct line. Has Bill Finger and Bob Kane create this character called Batman, who appears in Detective Comics number 27. They generally were doing it in response to the success of Superman. It's like, we need a superhero too. It's like, okay, we'll create this Bat guy. Yet for some reason they created a character with no superpowers. He just had the costume and a pair of guns.
Yeah, and if you ever saw the original design for Batman, he's this like weird red and yellow thing with giant like wings.
Yeah.
They look like weird sideways like bat wings and stuff.
Yep. That's true. And yeah, the comics at this point were actually doing really well. I mean, this is the true golden age of comics. It's ironic that it still started with Superman and Batman, and they still continue today to be mostly relevant. But we'll get to that in a minute. But at this point, actually, comics were super popular. I mean, print runs very quickly got up into the, at least 500,000, if not million print runs. I mean, they were generally doing large print runs at this point, and they were selling them. They also, at this point, in the early 1940s, over 90% of girls and boys from 7 to 17 read comic books, according to some statistics.
Yeah, this is something I think, to go back to our episode about the Japanese comic book industry. Anybody who's heard that, and if you haven't, go listen right now. What the hell are you waiting for? But
listen to both of them.
If you've listened to it, the idea that one of the reasons Japan had all these like weird, freaky comics and their industry was so resilient, and they had all these like strange genres and that, was because you had this gigantic audience. And you see that in the Golden Age, they had that gigantic audience. Basically, everybody at some point during their day would read a comic book.
Yep. Comic books were just popular culture at this point. Again, keep in mind, there is no TV at this point. The movies are a big thing. People go to the movies at least once a week. But again, you're generally going once a week. There's books, magazines. We're still looking at a mostly literate population that's reading. And comics are just a really popular form of entertainment. There is also the radio plays that are going on at this point. This is also during the great old-time radio period, the radio play golden age, so to speak, as well, which go hand in hand with superheroes, because, going back to this, Superman quickly becomes a radio play. In fact, it becomes the most popular radio play in America. Running several days a week. There will be installments of the Superman radio show, which is mostly him like beating up gangsters. And that, because there's literally no supervillains. And the radio play would eventually create, Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, Kryptonite. There's a whole bunch of things that actually are from the radio play that would work their way into the comics. The radio play, in some ways, was probably even more popular than the actual comic book, and really contributed to Superman becoming popular as he was. There was also Batman radio plays as well, but they were never very popular, and they didn't last that long, from what I know.
The Superman one, the radio thing is, again, a lot of what we think of as Superman came from the radio play, not the original comic.
Yes, exactly.
Because you know the story of Kryptonite, right?
They needed something to actually slow him down. He was way too powerful. They had no way to stop him, so they're like, Kryptonite.
No, there's something more specific.
Oh, what was it?
And this goes with what I said. The American comic industry a lot of times is affected by things outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
The actor who played Superman, as I recall, he got like injured or he got really sick.
He got sick. I remember this story, yes.
Yeah, and they needed some way to get Superman out of the story for a little bit so he could recoup. So they came up with this idea. It's this like weird mineral from his home planet makes him sick. So the actor could just come in and he's on like at death's door and he just goes, can't, and he could manage that and you splice that in and then you have the rest of like the B-listers like Lois and Jimmy taking care of the Thing for a couple of weeks while he's busy like moaning and groaning.
Yeah, pretty much. Yep,
so,
poor guy. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that, but then it became a staple later on because it became the only way to stop Superman once he got powerful enough.
Yeah, and then, as I recall too, one of the big things about the Superman radio play wasn't that how the government busted the Klan?
Yes, it was. The story to that goes that we already mentioned the Klan twice this episode. So, yes, the story of how Superman busted the Klan, which I think I mentioned in a previous episode, but just to quickly go over it. So what happens is this one guy infiltrates the Klan, and he learns all the different Klan codes, because they had all this secret lingo and all these, and I mean lingo, secret language and codes and all this stuff, and all the secrets of the Klan. And then he goes to the FBI and says, look, I've discovered all this stuff about the Klan. You got to put a stop to these guys. These guys are just bad. They're bad news. And the FBI goes, yeah, we're not that interested. Whatever. And he's like, but the Klan. And they're like, yeah, go away. I'm trying to remember the name of the dude, but you can look it up, actually. This is a true event. And so what he did is he instead said, okay, how can I get this information out there? So he contacted the creators of the Superman radio play, which of course most popular one in America, or one of them anyway, and said, I've got this information. Do you think you can use it? And they thought about it and they said, hell yeah, we can use it. And so Superman did this long running story called, was it Brothers of the Fiery Cross or something to that effect. And what happens is in the end, it's kind of about a character who gets involved with the Klan. And they use all the real Klan codes. They're using all the real Klan information in the actual show. And the thing is, when Klan members heard it and people heard it, they're like, and this is true, they thought, wow, we sound like a bunch of idiots. This sounds so stupid. And so a lot of people actually quit. Like the Klan recruiting just like plummeted after the Superman radio show made them look like a bunch of idiots. And so it's largely credited with helping to put a real capper on the Klan, which was already starting to get in a decline at this point, but was a little bit troublesome. But it kind of like knocked the wind out of them for a long time.
Yeah, that guy was Stetson Kennedy.
Yep, there he is. Stetson Kennedy. Yep, thanks for looking that up. And so, yeah, and that's the story of how Superman, in real life, defeated the Ku Klux Klan. Well, almost. They're kind of sort of still around, at least I've heard.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the Superman radio show, and of course there were other superheroes on the radio at this point. The Shadow was super popular.
Yeah.
There was the Green Hornet, I believe, also had a radio show. There were a whole bunch of them. Like, superheroes quickly became a big thing in radio, pulp, and comic books. Like, after their comic book debut, it didn't take long before superheroes were everywhere.
Yep. And then there was kind of one thing that really skyrocketed superheroes in popularity in comics.
Which was?
World War II.
Ah, you mean the American GIs taking comics all over the world?
Yeah, but I mean, even before then, when war broke out, it's like the superheroes enlisted right away.
Right.
And that's kind of what made superheroes, like, they just took off at that point. Like, everybody had superheroes by then, but that was what kind of cemented them as I guess a major like genre for the medium.
Yep, and that's where we get like Captain America and all the other like Nazi busting superheroes of that period.
Yep, and then that's also where you kind of really started to see supervillains.
Though usually they were Nazi supervillains at that point.
Yeah, or Japanese.
Or Japanese, yeah. There were some Japanese ones too. But because, of course, Americans wouldn't do that kind of stuff. But we're starting to really see supervillains at that point. Yeah, you're right.
Well, the irony with that, though, is in the comics they totally would. So, like, the evil, like, Nazi super scientists would build, like, a chemical that would turn their troopers into these, like, hulking brute fighting machines. Whereas, you know, Captain America is essentially the same story, but blonde. So,
yeah, he's good looking. He doesn't count.
Yeah, but that's what and it was also that idea, like, during times of war, you tend to, like, demonify the other side.
Yep, of course you do.
And I think what happens there, like, one of the things that made superheroes popular was the super villain. And you could have villains without, I guess, questioning audience credulity, because you already had people with heads full of these, like, horrible things the other side did. And a lot of times you'd present them as caricatures. So thinking, no, all Japanese guys are evil wizards, right? Like that, they can summon demons, right? Like that doesn't
Well, that's why we have to defeat them, dude.
That's right. And it's not as unreasonable an idea. And then that, what people don't realize, that's what kind of created the superhero as we know them nowadays.
Pretty much.
Because then you could just add all the crazy shit you wanted to it. And they did.
And boy, did they ever. Now, we should actually, at this point, going back to your point about there being comics of all kinds, take a little detour, because we were kind of jumping ahead when we went to World War II. There's one thing that should be brought up. MLJ, a publisher of the period, was producing a thing called Pep Comics as well, that were more of a general audience comic, mostly targeted towards, you know, teens and mostly teens, teen humor and such. They did have some superhero, sci-fi, and other stuff as well, adventure. Yeah. But a big part of it was teen stuff, especially this one that came out in 1942 by the name of Archie.
Yep. And you know what's funny?
What?
do you remember the tagline for early Archie comics?
No, what was the tagline?
The mirth of the nation. So we've done it again.
Wah.
Welcome to our clan episode, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, the mirth of the nation. Okay.
Yep. Now, the funny thing with that is the same guys who did Archie, as I recall, like just before, had done one called Wilbur.
I believe they did.
Which was basically Archie. So Archie is technically an Archie ripoff.
Did they? Are you sure? Not for MLJ anyway.
No, it was somebody else.
Not for Pep Comics. Okay, it was for someone else. Okay, so I'll assume that you're right. Not for Pep Comics anyway, because Pep Comics didn't publish it. There was nothing in Pep that was called Wilbur. But yes, let's take a look. Had they done it?
First Wilbur Comics was 1944.
Right. And Archie, as I just said, was 42. So that can't be right.
Actually made his first appearance in Zip Comics number 18, 3 months before Archie's first appearance.
And it was by the same creators.
Same company. Wasn't the same company. Creators.
Okay. That makes it by MLJ. Okay.
Now, the irony to that, too, is the original Archie wasn't what we think of as Archie.
Okay. I haven't read those early ones. How is it different?
The very original, like, Archie is more like a Bowery Boys kind of thing.
Oh, right. Okay.
Like, he's younger. It starts with Betty just moving onto the street and he's trying to impress her. And it's you can't say it's too different because, again, it's that, like, youthful hijinks kind of Andy Rooney sort of story. But Wilbur was closer to what we'd come to think of as Archie.
Right
out of the gate. Whereas the original Archie, it took a little bit. And then Archie does this weird thing a few years later, once they introduce, like, Veronica and Reggie, that it seems to almost take a jump just shy of like a college era hijinks kind of thing. Yeah, it's odd that way. Yeah. They almost seem more like college kids at that point. Yeah. And like, especially if you know the time, the fashion, and the trends and the things they're into, it's sort of, you get that weird back and forth until basically Dan DeCarlo comes in and kind of solidifies what we now know. Like back in, I think that was like in the 60s. Right, yeah, would have been. That he kind of, and then that's what Archie was forever and ever and ever, because that's, of course, when their pact with the devil came to fruition.
Well, yes, eventually you got to pay for it. I mean, wait, the devil, what are you saying, dude? They published, like, in the 70s and 80s, a ton of, like, Archie Christian comics. Archie is totally a Christian boy.
Yeah, but that was different. That was Spire.
Oh, so that was actually another company just borrowing the Archie characters and rights?
Yeah, because that was Al Hartley, who was a diehard Christian dude, who said, why can't we use these characters and use it to get the message out? And Spire Comics was it was a different branch that just used, like, the Archie characters.
Oh, always wondered about that. I just thought Archie went through a Christian phase.
Oh, no, that was something separate. It was part of the whole Archie conglomerate, but it was technically a different arm.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, because the Archie idea comes back later on, because holy crap, you can't imagine how many Archie ripoffs there were.
Well, that's because, again, comics were general audience at this point.
Yeah.
And they would be for quite some time, at least until the early 50s. And so as an end result, there was a huge, like, male and female audience running for comic books at this point, because it just wasn't all superheroes. It was everything.
Yeah, there's genres that disappeared, too, that I find amazing.
I bet there are. Well, I mean, westerns, horror, science fiction, humor, romance. I mean, every genre you could think of, plus more, was done as a comic book during this period.
Yep. And again, that's why a lot of people call it the Golden Age, because there was just so much, and sales were up, and no matter what you were into, you could find something that was part of it.
Right. Yep. And this continued. I mean, even in the early 1950s, Dell Comics came out, and they were actually one we don't hear about today, but Dell was actually one of the biggest publishers. In fact, they accounted for a third of all North American sales in the early 50s, okay?
But you know why?
Well, hold on a sec. They had 90 titles and averaged a circulation of 800,000 copies each issue. Okay, this is in the early 1950s, folks. 800,000 copies. The main one, however, were Walt Disney's comics and stories. There we go. They were publishing the Disney line, okay? Which they peaked a circulation of 3 million in 1953.
Yep.
11 of the top 25 best-selling comic books of all time are Dell titles.
Yeah. Now, there's a catch, kind of.
Right. Okay.
Because you sort of jumped a little bit ahead.
Well, we do that. Okay.
Yes, we do.
Go back if you want. Okay, go ahead.
Just got to go back. Because, again, once World War II ended, the bottom fell out of superheroing.
Yes, that's true.
Nobody cared anymore. Because, again, they were so tied to the war effort. Out of that comes what you're getting into, was right after World War II, there was a lot of experimenting, a lot of people looking for the next big thing. Dell is kind of part of that, because they got the Disney license.
Yep. By the way, at this point in 1954, at least by 1954, there were 40 publishers that were active in America.
At least. It's hard to keep track, because so many of them would come and go, and so many of them would be a branch of someone else or a branch of something else.
But basically, the major players at this point were Dell, obviously, as I just said, which were publishing the Disney comics.
Yep.
Atlas, which would eventually morph into what we know as Marvel Comics.
Yep.
DC, and Archie.
Yep.
In fact, Archie had become so popular that they changed the name from MLJ Publications to Archie Comics. It literally, the company just said, "Screw it, we're just going to publish Archie. We're just Archie. We're the Archie company."
Yeah. So there were a couple more that come up later on, because I think Fawcett was a big one.
Fawcett actually had ceased publishing by this point. By 54, Fawcett was already gone.
Okay, but
so it was Fiction House.
Them. Yeah, okay, and then I think Fox was another big one at this time too.
Yeah, there were like I said, there were 40 publishers.
Yeah,
over 40 publishers. There were over 40 publishers.
Because don't forget too that what you started seeing in like the 40s was a lot of like fly-by-night places.
Yep.
That would start up and print like 1 or 2 issues and then like fold.
Yep.
And this
actually, Yep. Continue. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
Oh, okay. This was also the time too that there was a like if you were like a comic writer or artist, you were probably getting like reamed really, really bad by whoever you were working for.
Yeah, you were basically they were all sweatshops basically. Yeah, it was pretty bad. I also found another statistic. So Circulation of comics peaked out in 1952 when 3,161 issues of various comics were published that year, with a total circulation at about 1 billion.
Yep.
Okay? And they would, after 1952, they would start dropping for the rest of the decade.
Yep.
Okay? With the biggest loss coming in 55, 56. And there's a reason for that, folks. We're getting to it.
Yep. Because what happens during that time is you get more experimenting.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where a lot of like genres that are dead now come from. Like, it amazed me when I finally had access, like thanks to the internet and that, to books from that era. Holy crap, were there a lot of like jungle adventurers?
Mm-hmm.
Like there were a lot, and we don't have that anymore. There were a fair number of like sports comics that we don't have anymore.
Oh yeah, every genre, well, crime, sports, everything that we did back then they did in comic form. And going back to one of my other notes, I should also say that television started to become standard in 1948. So what we're watching in the early 50s is the circulation of comics peaked probably in 52, because that's when the true rise of television starts.
Yeah.
So TV is one of the things that's cutting into the comic book world at this point. So it's not just what's coming in other forms. It's not just the government and other things that are coming. It's also TV that's starting to really hack into the comic books.
Well, we're going to get into, because the government isn't actually the problem. People don't realize that.
Dude, the government is always the problem. Sorry. Sorry. Channeling my inner Republican. All right, so.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff. How you doing?
So during this time,
yep,
the big thing that happens is...
The big thing that happens is before 54.
Yeah, kind of just before.
Oh, EC Comics.
There it is. Yep.
EC Comics comes out, mostly being published by William Gaines, who is the son of the founder of Famous Funnies, Maxwell Gaines.
Yep.
So the comic book tradition is continuing on.
Yep. Because EC Comics originally stood for Educational Comics.
Which makes perfect sense. They were definitely educational.
Well, once Will Gaines took over, he did stuff that people actually wanted to read.
Horror, crime.
Yeah, violence, science
fiction. Yeah. EC Comics were awesome.
Mm-hmm. Even today, like you read them today, a lot of them still hold up.
Oh yeah, I believe it. He was doing some of the most amazing stuff of its time. In fact, I'm sure by this point, all the other publishers must have been like shocked and scared by just how successful those EC Comics were.
They were one of the other things too that EC did was they were consistently high quality.
Mm-hmm.
Like if anybody's ever like read a Golden Age comic book, they come in two categories. They're either brilliant pieces of artistic mastery, or oh my god, did you draw this with your feet?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing in between. They're either brilliant or terrible. But EC was big on they were big on quality. They recognized that was something their audience wanted.
Right.
So they had stories that were actually written, that weren't word salad. They had artists. A lot of their artists would later on go on to other things. Like Wally Wood started at EC Comics.
Right. No, that makes sense.
I don't know if he started, but that was kind of where he took off, and he ended up becoming one of like their art directors.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, EC Comics just took off huge.
Yep.
In some ways too, I would say that the beginning of EC Comics, to tie in with like our horror host episode, I think was part of the establishment of the Monster Kids era. Like, well, we've been our parents.
Yes, you're right. Although the actual monster craze wouldn't actually come for a little bit. I mean, the monsters themselves are what? They're from the early 60s. They're not from the 50s at this point. I mean, but, this would actually have been the time when you start getting the Shock Theater packages, not too long after this. I'd have to check on when the Shock Theater started. Hold on, give me a sec.
But even then, too, like, this is the beginning of, this is the era of the independent theater.
Right.
So you're getting a lot of, like, B-horror movies and such.
Right. Shock Theater starts in 57.
Okay, so that's coming up.
So that's coming up. That'll actually come up. Unfortunately, that'll be post EC Comics, or at least the EC Comics we're talking about right now anyway.
It is, but I would still argue that this is part of that. It shows that zeitgeist is there.
Right, yeah. But keep in mind, actually, that there was still horror stuff running at that point. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, let's see, Vampira, the original horror host, actually starts in 1954. Yep. Shock Theater doesn't actually pop up until a little later.
Yeah, and that's, I think, and we talked about that too, which is why it's weird that you get Vampira, and then there's this like huge stretch of time before anybody thinks, why don't we do something like that?
Well, there's something weird. Don't some of the EC comics, especially the horror comics, don't they have horror hosts?
Yep. And
so wait, horror hosts technically appear in the comics first then before they appear on TV?
In theory, yeah.
That's weird. Okay.
It kind of is, because again, that was where, when you get Vampira, she's, I think, comes out of that tradition.
Right, yeah. Well, we talked about that with Michael Monaghan.
Yep.
How the horror host tradition does actually have a tradition. Oh, what was it?
The spook shows.
Spook shows. Yes, there we go. Yeah, it's the spook show tradition. Yes.
And I'm willing to bet that EC Comics decided to do that because of that older tradition. I thought that's an idea. Why don't we kind of bring that
Makes
back
sense.
and
okay,
and
that
they did.
Makes sense. And they did.
And this is where I say you can see that conflagration of ideas starting to happen.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so that's all that's coming together.
Yep.
All that's coming together, and comics are going great guns. I mean, they got that TV thing. It's a little bit iffy, but EC Comics is on the rise, and comics are becoming popular among all kids, and it's going to be smooth sailing from here on in. Right, Don?
No, because you get to what I consider to be the end of the golden age, which is 1954.
Yep.
Publication of Seduction of the Innocent.
Yep.
Which leads to the Senate Subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency.
Boo! Hiss! Boo! Idiots. They literally are about to kneecap our entire comic industry.
Actually, and this is where I think, well, not exactly, because what ends up happening, it was Dr. Fred Wortham.
Yes, it was.
Who is like a psychiatrist who writes Seduction of the Innocent was a study about how like comics in particular were corrupting the kids of today.
Yes.
And it's not the first treaty that he wrote on such things about pop culture corrupting society and that. It's his most well-known. If you get the chance to read it, I do recommend it.
Okay.
Because it's got some really strange things.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it ties into, like we've mentioned before, the idea that age-appropriate works in different directions. So if you're like a kid reading something for grown-ups, it might shock you, and you're not going to get it. But if you're a grown-up reading something for kids, you're going to read into it stuff that's just not there.
Right.
And if you're a teenager, you just don't understand anything, basically.
Well, yeah.
And that was there's a lot of that sort of thing with him, that he's reading stuff in that may or may not be there.
Apparently a whole lot of S&M and homosexual stuff.
Yeah. Now, to be fair to him, some of like the homoeroticism he's reading into the superhero stuff, some of it's funny because it's like he talks about the typical Batman and Robin pose with their hands on their hips, how they're jutting their crotches forward and you're like, okay, dude, just relax, man, just relax, it's okay. You know,
I think Wortham should have just been honest and come out of the closet. That's what I think.
Well, I'm not going to go that far, but it does sort of lean that way. But then he'd get other stuff where you'd say, well, you sort of have a point, because when you talk about like S&M, that was inherent to the original Wonder Woman stories.
Yes. Yeah, the Wonder Woman stories, the Wonder Woman's original outfit is a dominatrix outfit. Wonder Woman's magic lasso.
In 1940 cents.
In 1940, it was the 1940s version of a dominatrix outfit, kind of colored up a little bit. Her magic lasso. Think about that. Wonder Woman is an S&M dominatrix. Well, and she literally is.
And to that, there's references to that. I can remember like a reference to how like a little bit of spanking is good for a girl and that. And it's like, wow, that's you.
Yep. Exactly.
They should put that in like the new movie, and
I think so, because if you read those early Wonder Woman comics, every issue is about her tying up mostly other women.
Yeah,
and doing things to them, interesting things.
Kinda, and like I say, so Wertham wasn't exactly 100% out to lunch, but I think again he kind of lost sight of the big picture, because his theory was that, well, kids read this and it makes kids bad, but the thing was everybody read them.
And also, I'm not sure how popular Wonder Woman was back then, like as its own book. Well, I think it probably had some, but there were others, I know.
Yeah, because there's a lot of, like, when you read like a lot of the horror comics and that, there is a lot of strange subtext to some of these stories, eh?
Yeah, well, they're trying to be disturbing, and they succeeded.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think, like, for like Wertham's big argument, his research was shoddy, because, like, basically what he'd do is he said comic books make you into a delinquent. Mm-hmm. So he'd interview a bunch of delinquents and say, you read comic books? They say, yeah, sure we do. But everybody did. So, of course, they said, you could ask them, do you wear pants? Oh, no, pants lead to delinquency.
Yep, exactly.
And that's where I think he kind of, like, overstretches. But like I say, there's some questionable stuff, but it was also because it wasn't all being written for kids.
True.
Now,
general audience material is going to be like that. I mean, the early Japanese stuff has some incredibly questionable stuff in it. Hell, even some of the later Japanese stuff has some incredibly questionable stuff with it. I was recently reading the original Dragon Ball. I was mentioning to you before we started recording. Dude, have you read the original Dragon Ball?
Some of it.
There's some really questionable stuff in the original Dragon Ball. I was like, I should give copies of Dragon Ball to my nieces and nephews. And I read it and thought, yeah, I'll wait till they're older.
Yeah, because again, that was like more of like a teenager thing.
Yeah, it's definitely targeted more towards teens than it is for... I mean, also it's Japanese sensibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely Japanese sensibilities on that book. Anyway, it's so amazing, but it's so like, whoa, dude.
And that's what it is, because again, it's knowing who's supposed to be reading it.
Yeah, exactly.
And this I'm gonna I bring this up not because I'm trying to defend Dr. Wertham or anything, because I'm not.
Wertham lover.
Us old school cyberpunks laugh at people like that. Ha 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 ha. But it's the idea that notion of not exactly knowing who the audience is comes up a lot again and again.
Definitely.
So, but he comes out. He makes this fuss. People are like outraged. People are like, "Oh no, what do we do?" The U.S. government has a hearing on
subcommittee.
Yep. It's kind of a strange comedy of errors, because Will Gaines, being like the owner of EC, and EC being one of the big companies, he's one of the big speakers. And he completely botches it.
Right.
But he botches it. The dominant theory is that he was on weight loss drugs at the time. And weight loss drugs at the time were...
Speed.
Yeah, basically. So he was jacked up, and during one part of the hearing, he's coming down. The drugs are wearing off. And it was the infamous part where they have this like guy with an axe holding up the severed head of a woman. And he's trying to explain, no, our cover is in good taste. The cover in bad taste would have him holding the head up so you could see the stump and like blood and stuff dripping out of it, which is exactly what the cover was.
Right.
And again, that's the idea, is because he was stoned because he was on these like stupid weight loss pills.
Yeah, yep. But, exactly. Poor guy.
But even then, the U.S. government said that, no, this doesn't cause juvenile delinquency.
Right. But
what ends up happening afterwards is you get the Comics Code.
Yep.
And
which is?
The Comics Code was a list of these really bizarre rules that you couldn't follow. Like, you couldn't do any of this in your book. And anybody who remembers like old school comic books, you'll see like a little white stamp approved by the Comics Code Authority. The code was internal. It was a bunch of the companies got together and what they said was, because of this hearing, because of this book, we're scared that this is going to happen again, that they're going to keep bringing the hammer down. So we got to kind of rein things in to keep the public like off our back.
Yep.
That's
what they said.
Yeah, a lot of people think they specifically were out to take down EC Comics.
Well, when you look at the Comics Code, rules. They're literally, here's everything that makes EC popular. Okay, we'll just ban all of that.
Yeah,
everything that's allowing EC to actually beat us in the sales, we'll ban that.
And they're literally that, because it's rules like, you can't use the word crime, terror, horror in the cover of a book. Well, like, Vault of Horror and True Crime Stories were like top sellers for EC.
Yep. It was literally them kneecapping EC Comics.
Yep. You couldn't portray the undead, you couldn't portray vampires, you couldn't portray and that's the theory. Now, the interesting part was Dell didn't take part in it. Dell said, piss off, we're not going to join in. But Dell at the beginning of every of their books had, it was I forget what they called it, but it was like our commitment to parents.
Right.
And where they promised that they wouldn't show anything too terrible and vile, and you can trust us.
Right. Well, again, they were doing the Disney stuff, so that's perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, this had the horrible side effect, the Comics Code, of basically taking what was a general audience medium and shoving it down into a kids medium at this point. Because inadvertently, what these numbnuts had done is they basically said you can't produce anything that's not what we would call G-rated today. Mm-hmm. In fact, actually kids rated, not even G-rated. So this is the point where comics literally become, just when they're in this critical point where they're fighting with TV for an audience and they really have to choose where they're going to come into their own, these greedy, stupid idiots kneecap the whole industry and throw it down into a pit where it's going to take decades to dig itself out from. And even today, you could argue it's still not completely out of it.
Yeah. And this is... Oh, go ahead.
But it was great for superheroes, though.
Well, kind of. This is where I would say what begins now is the Silver Age.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I say that...
most people agree.
Yeah, and I say because what happens... What you've got at this point now is the big thing that runs through the Silver Age that you're either accepting or fighting is the idea that comic books are a kid's medium.
Mm-hmm.
Which I've mentioned before always drove me nuts, because at the same time that comic books had to be all sterile, the newspaper strips could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah, I know.
Within reason, but I mean, the old school Dick Tracy stuff, that gets pretty gruesome and horrifying.
Yep. Well, because again, general audience material as opposed to, comic books, which are now truly just kids stuff.
Yep. Now, what I'd offer up is one of our, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's going to be a lot of stuff we don't really get into. Mm-hmm. Because this is the point where I think you have a mainstream American comic book industry. Mm-hmm. Because that idea of the Comics Code Authority and everybody working under it sets the same constraints that even though Dell didn't follow, they weren't straying too far from.
Right.
One of the weird things is... EC Comics produces what ends up to be their most long-lasting feature at this time.
Mad Magazine.
That's right. And they do it because Mad is a magazine, not a comic book.
Yep. And also, it is comedy, though. It's not anything else. They're partly getting away with it because it's humor.
They are, but they're using a lot of the same guys, and they're using a lot of the same style and that.
That's true.
But this is something that's going to come back again. Another one of those weird little things going to come back in about 10 years. Correction, about 15 years. That idea that Mad was a magazine, not a comic book, so it wasn't subject to the same restrictions.
Very true.
But at any rate, everybody else was.
Everybody else was. And so the Silver Age is generally considered to start in October 1956 with Showcase number 4 from DC Comics, which of course stars... Who?
Batman.
The Flash.
Oh, I was going to say
Flash,
plenty
at least the modern Flash, is.
Yeah.
It's now this is interesting because this is the first time you're going to see the characters being rebooted. Because sometimes people forget this, that the 30s and 40s and 50s, early 50s superheroes were a whole bunch of different guys. They were a bunch of different characters, and they looked different. They had different costumes, but they decided, in the mid to late 50s to bring them into the modern age. So they rebooted all their characters.
Yeah. Well, DC did.
DC did anyway. Marvel would do something. Well, no, Marvel rebooted a couple characters too.
Yeah, but Marvel isn't here yet.
Marvel's not for long.
Yeah.
So anyway, so DC started doing that, and the first of their new heroes as old was the Flash.
Mm-hmm.
And he would become a symbol of the era, although was not super successful at first. In fact, he stayed with Showcase for a while until he eventually got his own book a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And so at this point, we're starting to get a new superhero bandwagon would eventually start to appear, so to speak. And in 1961, we would get Fantastic Four by Marvel Comics by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Fantastic Four #1, of course, which you know the story behind Fantastic Four #1, right?
About how Lee was going to quit?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Lee was going to quit, and if I remember right, his wife, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, was the one who convinced him to actually take one last stab at comic books.
Yeah, as I recall, she said, if you're quitting anyway, just go for broke.
Yeah, pretty much, yep.
Yeah.
And, so, and that's how it went. Now the comic industry owes that woman a lot. She made a huge contribution, actually. If it wasn't for her, Kirby might have still done it, but Lee, who knows what would have happened with Lee. But anyway, so as an end result, Fantastic Four #1 comes out. It does well, and they were trying a new kind of superhero because more at this point the DC superheroes had already been rebooted for a little bit.
Yeah,
and they were larger than life, gooder than good characters. And so the Marvel guys decided, well, let's do something a little more realistic.
Yeah.
And a little more, hipper, I guess you could say. Because, of course, this is the early 60s at this point. So this is the era of the hippies and the beatniks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at this point, they want something that also went for college kids.
Yeah. Well,
because they were kind of going for a slightly older generation as well.
Yeah, there's a catch with that, too, though.
Mm-hmm.
If I can take it back a little bit.
Go ahead.
When you get into the Silver Age, there's a lot of the companies go under.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a few. They're trying new things. The company that would become DC had a bunch of their old heroes. They still had Superman, Batman sold. I believe Wonder Woman still sold. Mm-hmm. Most of the other ones, nobody cared. Captain America was still around, but it was this weird pseudo-comedy version of it.
Right.
The rest of the superheroes, the companies were doing different things. What you started seeing in this era, you saw science fiction comics took off.
Yes, they did, yeah.
Because mostly nobody could complain. No, it's not a zombie. It's an alien. Oh, okay.
Exactly. It was a way around all the Comics Code rules was to make them science fiction based. Yep. Yeah.
Plus, this was the atomic age, so people were looking to the future. It's the same thing we were talking about with the Japanese stuff with Astro Boy.
Exactly. Well, this is the atomic age. There's a sci-fi boom going on at this point. Yep. There's a major sci-fi boom going on.
Because when you look at the Silver Age versions of the DC characters, a lot of them were going that sci-fi angle.
Right, that's true.
That they weren't, in the old days, they had like mystic powers, or they found this ancient talisman. Mm-hmm. But now they were looking at giving them the science fiction kind of origins.
Well, hold on a sec. Actually, that actually fits in because, oddly enough, though, do you remember what the origin of the original Flash was? Like the Golden Age Flash?
Wasn't it it was like a lightning bolt or something?
No, actually. The original Golden Age Flash was a chemist who created a formula which based around heavy water. Oh. And he absorbed the heavy water... breathed in all these weird heavy water chemical fumes, and that's what gave him his powers.
Okay.
So he was always a creation of science.
Mm-hmm.
And then, ironically enough, when they rebooted him, he's the Barry Allen Flash that we know is the one who actually gets his powers from a cross between chemicals and a lightning bolt.
Yeah, okay.
But the Flash has almost always been a character, one of the few superheroes who was a character of science.
Okay.
Right from the beginning. So it's ironic that he would be the herald of the Silver Age, the age of science and the atomic age in comic books.
Okay, that works.
Sorry.
No, but that does definitely show a direction. One of the other things I found weird, when you get to the 50s,
yep,
there was an uptick in war books.
Well, you had a lot of people at this point who, a lot of the writers were World War II veterans, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think a lot of them were, maybe it was nostalgia, maybe they were just drawing on their experience. I'm not sure, but if you recall right, this is also the era where there was that TV show Combat, which was about World War II fighting guys, and which was very popular, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so I can totally see that, where, they're all veterans writing these comic books, not all of them, but many of them. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to get a lot of that World War II stuff coming in, I suspect.
There was, but a lot of them had this weird twist. Because, again, at this point, a lot of them end up being set in Korea.
Oh, okay.
Because the Korean War starts up. But they're these weird comedic versions.
Okay.
Like, people don't realize... I didn't realize this. Everybody knows G.I. Joe from the 80s.
Yes, of course.
In the 60s, going into the 70s, like, G.I. Joe came out in the 60s, the original toys.
Right. Mm-hmm.
DC did a comic book during the 60s that was kind of a generic, like, action war hero story.
Right.
But there was a G.I. Joe in the 50s.
Okay.
And it's this weird mix between, like, the horrors of war and Gomer Pyle USMC. Like, it's so strange. And there were a few of them from that era that are these strange, like, picture the wacky comedy where the main character's arguing, because it's always a sergeant. He's always arguing with a sergeant.
Right, of course.
And hijinks ensue, and then they get lost, and they're trapped in the battlefield, and then the bad guys show up, and there's these scenes of them gruesomely dispatching them in realistic combat, and then the hijinks continue. It's like, wow, that's just, wow.
Okay.
But that was the thing. That was just another one of the weird little asides, because that sort of kind of happens. Like I said, the superheroes, the bigger companies are the main thing. That's kind of at the side. Mm-hmm. But it's still this weird thing I've never been able to wrap my head around.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can totally see that. Also, something else that pops up in the 60s is we get the first of the underground comics as well.
Yeah, that depending on how you look at it, either happens at the beginning or the end of the 60s.
I assume the beginning you're referring to The Adventures of Jesus.
Yeah.
Frank Stack in 62.
Yeah.
Or you're referring to Robert Crumb, who starts his work in Zap Comics in 1968.
Yeah, because you had, like we were saying, that you had this mainstream, comic books had been kidified. Mm-hmm. Superheroes were kind of a big thing, but they tended to be kidified. There was comedy books were popular at this time too. Like the Archie clones were coming like almost unstoppably over the horizon. Many of which were done by Dan DeCarlo himself.
Right.
Oddly,
he was a machine.
He sure was. And a lot of people weren't happy with that. So when you get to the 50s, again, you get into the monster era.
Right.
I think you've got a lot of people who are older now that are disgruntled about EC getting neutered. Mm-hmm. You've got the beatniks. You've got the beginning of the counterculture. You've got teen culture. Teen culture is historically marketed as rebellion.
Right.
So you have the beginnings of what become the undergrounds. And that was where you got stuff like Big Daddy Roth doing Ratfink.
Right.
Yeah, things like you got The Adventures of Jesus, which again I highly recommend if you get the chance.
You mentioned the 50s era, so this is the 60s you're talking about.
Well, this is going into it, late 50s, early 60s.
Okay, yeah.
But the undergrounds, as we know them, really, like, it was Crumb and a bunch of those guys. Like, Zap Comics #1
right,
is what a lot of people consider the beginning of the real underground comics.
Right. Makes sense.
Now, they were happening before then. If you want to go back to the 30s, you had the Tijuana Bibles, which were technically the same thing.
With more or less sex, depending on your point of view.
Well, but they had that attitude. Like, they were the original Cherry Pop-Tart.
Right, yeah.
Except rather than come up with something that was basically an Archie clone as parody, they would just use the actual established characters and do these weird little porn comics with them.
Yeah, they would just do Archie porn comics. Yep.
Well, not Archie, because Archie wasn't around. They'd do, like, Ella Cinder, or I saw one with Wimpy from Popeye. It's like, oh, no.
Oh, yeah, I've seen one with Wimpy and Olive Oil. There's a few of them kicking around online. Yeah, Popeye is in some. Betty Boop. I believe there's some Tijuana Bibles with Betty Boop.
Yeah, any popular character at the time was somebody did one.
Yep.
So
although they're really crude, like really, really crude.
Yeah, but then again,
in every sense of the word.
Yeah, so were a lot of the early independents in that.
That's true.
And this is, again, it's that idea. It was sort of always there, but this is where it solidifies.
Right. Yep, makes sense.
And the undergrounds are a weird thing
Mm-hmm.
because they don't last very long.
Okay.
By about 73, 74, it was done.
But there are still underground comics today. But are you referring to the classic undergrounds?
Well, this is a catch. It's the same idea if you're into music about what is punk rock.
Okay.
Because real punk rock only lasted a couple years, but it led to other stuff like later on.
Right. Okay.
Because what happens with the undergrounds is, and we've talked about this before, they kind of make their way into the late 70s, into the independents.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Like, the undergrounds were truly underground, and they were, like, designed to be offensive and subversive, and like, Subvert Comics was an actual comic book that was being published back. As I recall, they published Trash Man, which is one of my all-time favorites.
Right. Well, yes.
And again, it was sort of a specific movement, but it led to things later on.
Yep. Well, like most underground comics, just like we talked about with the Japanese stuff, the Gekiga, were almost the same thing. Where they came in, they were an alternative comics movement that would later have huge influences on the mainstream comic movement, even though they only existed for a brief period of time.
Yep, and that's what these did. Again, too, it was capitalizing on something, because you find a lot of the underground guys loved Mad Magazine,
right?
Because Mad Magazine really did have that kind of underground aesthetic.
Yeah.
Of like peeling back the veneer.
Oh, it did.
So, and then that was the ideal, except they wanted to get more in your face about it.
Definitely, yeah.
And then, while that's going on, you also have like the Silver Age kidified stuff.
Well, kidified and teen. Remember, during the Silver Age, comics kind of start to grow back up again.
They do, but that was I won't say it happened by accident, but they found out by accident.
Well, they found out because they discovered that their readership was actually getting older.
Yep.
And they realized that, oh, wait, we're not doing the teens anymore. It's mostly college kids reading these things.
Yep.
Well, okay, we should start writing to them.
And that was what you said. That was what happened with Marvel.
Yeah, pretty much.
Was they came out, they did stories. I don't know if you'd say they were a little edgier, but that idea of the hero with problems, they wanted them more grounded. They wanted something more tangible. And they did surveys, and they found out that, their audience, they thought it would be kids, but it was like late teens and college guys that were reading all the Marvel comics.
Yep. And their characters in general were a little bit what I would describe as hipper. Like, if you read the... an interesting one to read, if you ever get the chance, for those who haven't read them, is go find the collections of the early 1960s Avengers comics and read them, especially once you get past like Avengers like 10 or issue 10 or 12, because at this point you're in the what's sometimes referred to as Cap's Cookie Quartet era, and that's when things start getting really interesting at that point, because I try to remember who was writing it. I think it might have been Don Heck at that point, and slowly what you start to see is, as Heck's style evolves and everything, it becomes very, how can I put this? There's a very odd style to the comics that I can't put my finger on. The nearest thing I can remember, the nearest thing I can compare it to, and this will sound really, really weird to anyone who hasn't actually read them and seen it, is there's a movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is a very famous movie from that era. And there's a hipness to that movie and a style to that movie that actually the early Avengers, especially once Hawkeye joins and such, actually kind of reflect that. Where they're very much products of their New York environment. In fact, they revel in the fact that these are New York stories and New York, and it's about the hip culture of New York. And they're constantly making references to it and the Avengers are constantly talking to the fellow citizens of New York, who of course are all these like young hip people and stuff like that. It's very it's very interesting. It's a fascinating period to read from the Avengers. It really is.
Yeah, Captain America will like go hang out at a hippie bar, and they'll do
Yep.
like 6 or 7 pages of him just talking current events with the hippies and that. Yeah.
Yep. They do stuff like that. Yeah, and starting to understand them and everything. But this also, of course, is also where the Black Panther comes from.
Yeah.
He's from this period. I'm pretty sure Heck created him. I'm not 100% sure on that one. But, here, let me check. Did Don Heck create...
I think Stan Lee created him.
Was it Stan Lee that created the Black Panther?
I think he did.
Let's see. Heck created Bill Foster, who became Black Goliath in 1966. You're right. Maybe the Black Panther wasn't by Heck, because I remember he first appears in. He first appears in the Avengers comics. Like, he's an Avengers character. Because they're not sure what to do with him when he first appears.
Right.
Like, they're not sure, is this dude a villain? Is he a hero? What is he? Lee and Kirby. Actually, I'm completely wrong. The Black Panther was created in Fantastic Four number 52 by Lee and Kirby. So it would have come probably during, the late part of Lee and Kirby's legendary Fantastic Four run, basically. Because this would have been 66. And then eventually he would pop up in the Avengers and even become a member of the Avengers.
Yeah.
But, okay, I had always thought he was an Avengers character, but I guess that's who I associate him with. Anyway, so there we go. But anyway, the Avengers of this period are fascinating from the view of New York culture that they actually give.
Yeah.
Because remember, these people lived in New York. New York was their place. For the actors, for the writers, the artists, the characters, everyone lived in New York, and they were all New York creatures and New York publishers. And so that's what you were getting a view of. You were getting this glamorized superhero view of New York. And I would actually say with Marvel Comics, that kind of continued right up until maybe the 90s or so.
Yeah, it kind of comes and goes depending who's writing and how hip the actual writers are.
Right, but for example, even in the 80s, the Marvel Comics characters were hanging out with, the 80s David Letterman, for example, who was originally, of course, based in New York. I mean, they were so New York, it hurt. Like, a lot of the Marvel Comics. Right up until, probably up until about the, late 80s, maybe the Image era, is when we start to see them. Because at that point, they've got a lot more people from outside New York who are writing the books. Yeah. And it's not just, they're not New York culture and New York creators anymore. It's people from all over the country are creating them.
Yeah.
And people all over the country are writing them. So, okay, but we've jumped ahead in time a little bit. So we should probably... Okay, so the 60s happened. The Silver Age happens. The Underground Comics happens. Anything else we want to say about the Silver Age?
Oh, because when you're talking about Marvel, aiming for getting that, older audience...
Yep.
At DC, that's the Go-Go Checks era.
The Go-Go Checks era?
Yeah, they call it that because if you see the comics from that era that DC puts out, have these checkerboard pattern around the top and the bottom. Yes.
And that's where, for example, the Teen Titans came from. The original Teen Titans were just the sidekicks of the main characters and are so hip it hurts.
Yeah, because
they speak in weird hipster slang.
Well, what 40-year-olds think teenagers talk like.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I say it's really weird.
Well, because that's my favorite era of DC.
Right, okay.
And it's because you've got them, it does look like they're saying, well, Marvel's getting all of these, because Marvel's sales were climbing during this period.
Right.
And they're getting all these sales. What are the kids into? And you can tell they're desperately trying to do stuff that the kids would like, but the characters, and I imagine most of the staff, they come from the previous generation of comics.
Yep.
So you get these bizarre mixes and these super freaky comics that I can see having if you were a teenager at the time just wanting nothing to do with, but
right,
being looking at them decades later, they're just these fascinating wow, where did that come from? Prez.
Yeah.
America's first teenage president. And you're this is what you think teenagers are like? Okay, I guess, sure.
I think you're finding them fascinating for the same reason I find the Marvel books of that era fascinating, because of their portrayal of New York culture. That's their take on it. Well, you're talking about DC's take on it.
Oh, because but it's because the DC ones are they're so wrong they become their own thing.
Right. Okay, they're very trippy. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why. And that lasts for like a few years, and they come up with all these crazy concepts that you're like,
My personal favorite is the Wonder Woman of that era.
oh, when she gives up her powers.
She gives up her powers to become a feminist, social justice, kung fu master spy.
I know. Gee.
All of those things, really. She like that's not literally. That's go read them. That's basically what it is. They're all about social justice, and they're all about like. And she's a kung fu master now because she literally studies kung fu, and she's a spy, and she has no powers whatsoever.
But
she's just Diana Prince, kung fu master spy.
Yeah, they all did that too because the Teen Titans do that at one point where they give up their powers and they become like secret agents.
Because that was super popular at that point. I know. This is the era of the Bond craze.
Yeah, because that's the thing with the Teen Titans. They were working for a guy named Mr. Jupiter, who like nobody knew who he was, and he was this mysterious like figure that had them doing like secret agent stuff.
Right. Yep.
Because back in like a few years back, when they did this storyline where Maxwell Lord was possessed by like an alien or something, and he's the main villain, and I think it was like Wonder Woman kills him. Right. Originally, that was supposed to be Mr. Jupiter.
Oh, okay.
And they changed it to Maxwell Lord because they said nobody's going to know who the hell this guy is.
Right. Huh.
And
okay.
That all comes out of this weird. There's also the infamous DC that DC put out a questionnaire for their audience.
Mm-hmm.
Again, because you can tell they're trying to figure out what makes Marvel tick, and it's like they give a list of topics and they say, are you like uninterested? How did it was like 3 categories. It was like,
okay,
do you not care? Are you interested or very interested? And it's like thing like I like skateboarding or television, and one of them is black people, and you're like, oh my god. And that's an actual that's an actual questionnaire they had in their books from that era. Right. And again, it's because it's that thing I can totally see what they're doing now. Right. You know, what do the kids want? I don't know, like equal rights and that are in. Do they like minorities or something? I don't know. Let's do that, I guess.
Wow. Yeah. So that's pretty much it. Yep. They're just doing like, okay, what does our audience like? Okay, well, we'll just do lots of that.
Yeah. Oh, we have to do a show on like DC Go-Go Checks era comics. We desperately do.
Okay. Well, we'll put that on the list. We'll put that on the list. Okay, yeah, it's definitely an interesting era. That part I will absolutely agree with.
Yep.
Okay, so let's continue our move on. So, is there anything else about the Silver Age we want to talk about?
I think for the big main thing, I think we've hit it all. Like I said, there's other stuff going on, but it's not really making a dent in the big overall picture.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So, all right. So let's move on to the Bronze Age. Now, the Bronze Age is generally considered to start somewhere in the 70s. There's not an actual, like, official date where it starts, according to most comic historians. There's I get like various versions of it. I've seen versions that say, where is it? Where was it? I had it here somewhere. Okay, I've lost it. But anyway, yeah, it starts somewhere around like maybe 74, 75, something like that. Just because there wasn't really a particular book that really like starts it off.
Or event, because remember, like,
right,
you have different, like the Senate hearing has a big effect.
Right.
World War II had a big effect.
Yeah, I could see that. But the Bronze Age is, in a lot of ways, what people think of as comics, actually. Okay, one thing that people do often talk about at the beginning of the Bronze Age is the whole Green Lantern, Green Arrow comic.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of people do consider that possibly from October 1971, the beginning of the Bronze Age.
Although there's one that precedes it.
Is there? Because I thought that was the very first comic that was released since 1956 without the comics code on it.
No, that was the Spider-Man 96, which is just like the year before, I think.
Okay.
The drug issue.
The drug issue, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the drug issue is also the one, of course, that it's also about drugs, of course, the Green Lantern, Green Arrow. It's where they discover Speedy, Green Arrow's sidekick, is basically a total heroin addict at this point.
Yeah, because what happens was the Spider-Man one was kind of a little, I'm going to say Dragnet-y. If you've ever seen Dragnet, you know exactly what I'm getting at.
Right.
Because they wanted to do a story about drugs, because that was kind of a big concern at the time.
Right.
And the Comics Code said, no drugs ever. So Stan Lee said, no, to hell with you, we're going to do it. And they put the book out.
Right.
But when you read it, it's still kind of a little cartoony in how it handles drugs.
Right.
Like, as I recall, a guy takes, like, LSD and jumps off a building flapping his arms and stuff because he thinks he can fly.
Right, yeah.
Which isn't realistic. But when DC did it, they said, well, we wanted to do that, but we wanted to do it a little more realistic. And that's why they said, no, Speedy's hooked on smack.
Yep. That's pretty realistic.
And I can kind of see that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the Bronze Age kind of... It's characterized by two things.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, and I think this is why people will consider... you could consider the Green Lantern, Green Arrow... issue 85, the beginning.
Right.
Because the Bronze Age is characterized with... They're trying to write, for lack of a better word, mature stories.
Right.
Because they realize they have an older audience, and that audience is getting older.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to appeal to them. But the other thing that's going on at the same time is rapidly declining sales.
Yeah. Yeah, they're looking at their sales are dropping compared to where they were before, and they were pretty high before.
Yeah, like in the 50s and even the 60s, but by the 70s, I can't think of anything specific event that kicked that off.
Right.
But you can see, I think part of it too, like people were moving away from the old stuff.
Right.
At the time, early 70s, one of Marvel's biggest sellers was Conan.
Right.
Which wasn't a superhero. When you look at if you look at the subscription lists from that time,
yep,
Marvel and DC they're still doing like horror comics and Western comics.
Yeah, in 1970 they published the Conan the Barbarian comics. Yeah, King Kull, Red Sonja, Solomon Kane. DC responded with Warlord, Beowulf, Fafnir and the Grey Mouser comics. Tarzan started coming out from Gold Key. Then they also started doing John Carter and Mtor, and there were some other characters as well. I mean, this was actually a sword and sorcery boom going on in the beginning of the 70s as well. Yep. And so, yeah, we're getting some of that early space fantasy and sword and sorcery stuff being revived at this point. And so they're trying to do different stuff.
Yeah,
they're trying different things at this point.
Now, and that's out of desperation.
Yes, exactly. Remember, business people are always forced out of desperation to try different things.
Yeah, because at one point, too, if you remember, I think it's 75 or 76, DC had a new, executive editor, I think she was.
Right.
And they were going to make a big push, and they put out this big 2-page ad. Right. The new DC, there's no stopping us now, and it lists, 20 new books that are coming out.
Right.
And, half of them never did.
Oh, okay.
And it was because, again, it's that idea, nobody knew what the next big thing was going to be. But they desperately needed it because the old standbys were starting to go into decline.
Right.
I think part of the problem might have been what happened to your superhero books in the 90s. Because again, we only lived the same 2 decades over and over. Was that in the 70s they knew they had an older audience and they were writing to them. But that kind of made it impenetrable to a new audience or to kids.
Right.
So you weren't bringing in that next generation of readers.
Right.
And 2 things happened that kind of rectify that.
Okay, and they are?
I think you were edging up to the big one. The thing that saved the comic industry.
The death of Gwen Stacy?
No.
Chucking the Comics Code Authority?
No, because that didn't happen for a little bit.
Okay, so what's the big one?
I was, of course, going to refer to the comic Brother Power the Geek.
See, that's not the answer I would have given. Okay.
No,
yeah.
It wasn't. Oh, well, you know what ended up saving the comic industry?
Actually, I don't. What saved them?
Star Wars.
Oh, yes, that small film. I just always forget about it. I mean, it's just such a... Yeah, because what happened is... Yes, okay, continue. So Marvel decided to start experimenting with this thing called tie-in comics.
Yep.
Now, they'd already been doing it, obviously, because I just mentioned, of course, Conan and all those other ones. But Marvel noticed that, hey, there's a lot of money in these tie-in comics things.
Yeah.
And so they started publishing progressively more and more of them as the 70s would go on. They would publish Master of Kung Fu to go in with the Kung Fu craze that was going on during that period. They would publish, of course, movie tie-ins like Planet of the Apes, Godzilla, Rogan's Run, Indiana Jones, Space Odyssey, Star Wars, Man from Atlantis, Battlestar Galactica, A-Team, Welcome Back, Kotter.
That was DC.
I mean...
Welcome Back, Kotter was DC.
Welcome Back, Kotter was DC. I thought that was Marvel, but anyway, whatever. Marvel and DC. Okay, DC was doing it too.
Yep. Actually, Marvel and DC were swapping around characters because they, I think they both did Doc Savage at one point.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, because it was any license that you could get because the idea was it came with a ready-made audience.
Yeah. Yep, that's true. Well, anything, again, license you can get. Things haven't changed, really. People are just desperate for any, known property that they can capitalize on.
Yeah.
It's almost, it's kind of the same thing today, of course, with people constantly remaking movies and TV shows from previous eras because they're known names and they're things that we can capitalize on.
And tying into that idea, what happened during like the 70s, superheroes were crazy popular, but not the comic books. They were popular as like licensing properties.
Yeah. Well, again, we were getting some superhero cartoons at this point.
Yeah.
Filmation, I believe, was doing some. They might have been during the 60s, but I believe during the 70s. Well, during the 70s, we had the Super Friends.
Yep. God help us.
Yeah, I know. The no violence superhero comics.
Yep. But that was the idea. You saw them. Superheroes were cartoons. They were action figures. They were T-shirts. People didn't think of them as comic books. It's kind of what happened when the movies took off in the aughts. That the Avengers movie comes out and everybody on Earth sees it twice, but the comic book has a print run of like 50,000 copies. Yeah, because people don't think of them as comic books anymore, and that was what was happening in the 70s. Yep.
Well, and I think that's continued in a lot of ways. I think for a lot of people, for example, especially the current generation, and if you ask them about the X-Men, how their love of the X-Men, they're going to tell you about X-Men the animated series. They're not going to tell you about the comics. Yep. I mean, it depends on who they are. True geeks will probably tell you about the comics, but yeah, a lot of people will just talk about X-Men the animated series, especially non-comic fans. Yeah. They know the X-Men, but that's how they know them.
Or the movies.
Yeah, exactly, which are now old enough. The first X-Men movie, I think, came out in...
99?
Was it 99?
I think it was 99.
I thought it was around 2000. Anyway, around that period, yeah. So think about how old that is now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Although they tried to make an X-Men movie in the 80s, it just didn't quite work out so well. Uh-huh. Because again, okay, so what happened is, superheroes properties had a big boom, but the comics weren't doing that well. And then, of course, the sales are dropping, and then Star Wars comes out, and Marvel Comics does a Star Wars comic, and they sell like a gazillion copies. Yep, it pretty much saves the company.
Yeah, anything with Star Wars on it sold a gazillion whatevers.
Yep, and that really, really helped reboot during the 70s. The whole Marvel Comics, basically. See, Marvel Comics history is basically a history of almost going bankrupt and then stuff happens. Yeah. That's pretty much Marvel Comics' entire history.
Yeah. Well, that kind of reboots everything, though, because DC wasn't doing well. And comics in general picked up, and I have a funny feeling it's because what happened was the marketing thing in reverse.
Right.
That the comic book came out, people were desperate for anything Star Wars, so they bought the comic, and then they go, oh, wait, there are these other comic books?
Yeah, pretty much.
And this was the time when a comic book could still be an impulse buy.
Mm-hmm. So they were cheap, 10 cents.
Yeah, they'd pick a few other things up. Companies started playing on the Star Wars formula. Yep. So you got, again, they'd capitalize that sword and sorcery boom. Even superheroes of the day started going that science fantasy route.
Yep.
Like, that was where you got, like, say, the all-new, all-different X-Men that in no time at all were part of dealing with an intergalactic empire and...
Oh, yeah, exactly. They were involved with their own little Star Wars saga.
Yeah.
Although, wait a moment, let me check, though. Interesting question. The all-new X-Men was introduced in 1975... So yes, that would actually, so the whole Shi'ar saga would have tied in nicely with the X-Men, actually.
Yep.
Or sorry, the whole Shi'ar saga would have tied in nicely with Star Wars.
Yep, and it was part of like that zeitgeist of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then that, like I say, that rebooted the comics industry. One of the things that happens in the 70s during the Bronze Age is basically every other company dies.
Yes, there's that too. Now, was that largely due to the whole shifting of the distributors?
I think what ends up happening, the shenanigans with the distributors sort of comes into play going into the 80s.
Okay.
But you had comics in general were in decline.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, only the biggest were able to kind of weather the storm.
Right.
So again, by the early
Barely.
by the early 80s, like most of the, like I think by then Charlton's gone, like DC bought them. Modern didn't last very long. Red Circle is like gone. Like all the little guys, you've got your Marvel and DC, and for reasons we'll be getting into shortly, they become what people think of comic books as.
Right.
You've got Archie, because as long as people have grandparents, Archie comics will still sell.
Right.
You had Harvey was still around.
Right.
But remember, Harvey's not going to last too much longer. Like by the end of the 80s, that they're gone. And they were another huge company.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this overall decline, and then what ends up happening is Star Wars comes out, boosts the industry. Marvel and DC kind of get their second wind.
Right.
They take off. What's going on behind the scenes at this time that does become important is you've got the beginnings of the independent comics.
Right.
And like we said, a lot of the early independents kind of capitalized on the distribution chains that were established by the undergrounds.
Yeah.
Some of them come out of that. You also have the beginning of the comic book store by the end of the 70s. And what happens is the comic book store, we've mentioned this before, is catering to people who aren't reading mainstream comics.
Yep.
And that's why they were called independents, and they become totally like their own thing.
Yep.
Now, the mainstream guys, Marvel and DC, over the 80s will mine from them. Like, they'll take artists, they'll take ideas and that. But the independents for a long time were their own thing.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, and that starts officially with Warp Graphics in 77 doing ElfQuest.
Ah, so ElfQuest was the herald of the whole independent black and white movement.
Officially, they were the beginning of the independents. Not just the black and white movement, like they were the beginning of independent comics.
Okay.
And I think shortly thereafter you get like Eclipse.
Right.
And then going into the 80s you get First, and First was another one of the bigger ones.
Right.
And then you get a bunch, like what happens is the people who gave up on, there's people who gave up on comic books.
Right.
But still thought they might enjoy that kind of thing. And some of them keyed into these independents, and you had the comic book stores, which is where they buy stuff. And there's enough of an audience, and that audience starts building, that you get comic book stores in big cities.
Right.
And they bring you the new stuff. They also, a big thing that comic book shops do is back issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. Lots of them.
Like that was basically like their bread and butter, was the collectors coming in for the back issues, the fans coming in for the new independents.
Right. Well, comics at this point had become a collector's item.
Yep.
They literally were an investment at this point for the very first time in history. And suddenly, of course, we comic book collectors and fans were suddenly respected, because suddenly in American culture, comic books were worth money, and therefore they had respect for the first time in a long time.
Kind of. You're getting a little bit ahead. You're getting definitely the beginning of that.
Right.
But that doesn't happen until the modern age.
Well, no, not exactly.
Ish.
I mean, well, okay, ish. You're right. Because of yeah, you're right. Okay, that's true. Because the modern age is generally defined, as we said earlier, as starting with in '86 with the release of the Dark Knight Returns and the Watchmen. Some people would take it a year back and say Crisis on Infinite Earths started the modern age in '85. But either way, basically comics were in for a big change because the modern age begins.
Yeah, I take it back to Crisis.
Okay.
Because again, what Crisis on Infinite Earths did, it was DC saying, well, a lot of the people who are like reading our books,
Right.
they're older. We've got like at this point we've got like 40 something years of history with our characters.
Mm-hmm.
They've gone through 2 or 3 iterations. We've like you've gone from like the dark gritty pulp hero Batman that just guns guys down to like Batman space cop who flies the bat jet to planet Schmeedle because the Schmeedlians are having trouble that the Oogie Buggies are taking their woofle plants and stuff. And
oh my God, not the woofle plant.
But you've got all this going, and they said, well, we want to kind of make it cohesive. We're going to pare it down. We're going to do this big event that's going to kind of reset our universe. Give us our chance to basically be Marvel from the 60s is what they wanted.
Right.
So we'll do that. And what happens at that point is there's an acknowledgement of story and continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the big selling point. That's what makes the modern era, is that people are saying, well, no, story. And although the mainstream guys at the time were saying, no, they're not just for kids, they're literature. But it was that
It was that battle by the people who appreciated comic books with versus the people who still saw them as kids stuff. That was a big part of our youth.
Yeah, and this is where the era gets muddy, because I think what you had a few years prior with the independent boom was those ideas, because the independent books, they were mostly creator-owned.
Right.
It would be 1 or 2 people writing the story. They could have it progress. They could have it progress how they wanted. They were writing for older audience members. They were doing like more, I guess, complex issues with their books. And I think that kind of sets the stage for the official modern era. Right. And the independents are starting to build. But what hampers them is the black and white glut.
Okay, how so?
Well, because anybody with, a couple of bucks and some ambition could publish a comic. And they did.
And they did.
And most of them sucked. We've had the people from, we had Shane and Dave from Stupid Comics on. Yep. And if you want an example, I recommend their entire website.
Pretty much, yep.
Yeah. And they have an 80s section. And what was happening at the time was that comic books that sold to newsstands could be returned. So if they didn't sell, the distributors would send them back to the publisher and get a refund. Comic shops didn't do that.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, Marvel and DC were desperate to get into the comic shops because then they wouldn't have to deal with returns. The people in the comic shops didn't really care for Marvel and DC because they wanted this new stuff. The black and white glut hits. The comic shop owners have to order like months ahead of time. They don't know if the Protectors is going to actually be a hit or worth reading or anything. So they have to guess, and it's killing them because they're getting a lot of this stuff in, because more and more is coming out, and more of it is terrible. Right. So they start falling to the old standbys. They start falling to names they recognize, the stuff that sells. You get the bottom fall out of the independents because all these different companies that are popping up can't be sustained. They're not getting the sales because nobody's taking a chance on anything new. The comic shops are starting to see this like decline in material that they can bring in. They don't know what to do. Marvel and DC make the jump. They get a lot of press with a year after Crisis with like the Dark Knight Returns, the Watchmen. We talked about the speculator market being created essentially by the Punisher. Right. CNN ran a story about the Punisher comic, and it was mostly old comics are worth money. So that's bringing more people and looking for your Marvels and your DCs.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's kind of again, an example of how we have a mainstream comic in it. We did for a long time. And all of this other stuff is kind of side stuff that feeds into it one way or another, but you've got this giant juggernaut that just keeps on rolling.
Yeah.
And yeah, that takes us the mainstream. The modern era kind of becomes Marvel and DC and those who wish to copy them.
Yep, pretty much.
And there's still books that make decent sales, but they're not... At this time, if a Marvel comic had a print run of 250,000, they'd cancel it because it was a failure.
Yeah, print run of 250,000. Just for general reference and comparison, folks, do you know what the average Marvel comic prints today?
I think it's like 40.
20.
Holy shit. And that's a thing.
I've heard they're running as 20.
Yikes.
But we'll get to that in a little bit. So we get into the modern comic era. So everybody and their brother starts printing comics eventually. We've gone through the Mutant Ninja Turtles boom in the black and white glut.
Yep.
And then there's a whole big boom as this new, young, hip generation of artists start coming out of Marvel.
Yep.
Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld. These new, hip, young artists completely redefine, a lot of the Marvel characters and, really help, bringing a lot of Marvel sales in.
Yeah.
But there's a small problem. When they say, look, we're the ones bringing in all the money, Marvel Comics says, yeah, and you better keep doing it too if you know what's good for you.
Mm-hmm.
So these hip, young, artists and writers, mostly artists, get together and say, what would happen if we all quit and just took our fandom and created a whole new comic company of our own? Mm-hmm. And they all say, hey, that's a great idea. I think it's Todd McFarlane was basically the mastermind behind this because he's more of the businessman type of the set.
Yeah.
And the others just kind of followed along from what I know.
I think it was McFarlane and Liefeld's wife because I think his wife is a big, like she's the business end of their partnership.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah. So they basically say, "Yep. Why are you making money for these guys?" And of course, at this point, merchandise is selling, and for big bucks for Marvel, based on the art from these guys. This is the point where Liefeld has redefined the X-Force at this point.
Yeah.
He's created X-Force. He redefined the New Mutants and eventually became X-Force. And all this stuff's going on. Jim Lee's the hot young name. And so they all get together and form Image Comics.
Yep.
One of the best named, most appropriately named comic companies in the history of comicdom.
Yeah, I would say a little bit before that is the beginning of the postmodern era.
Okay, why so?
I would say the postmodern begins with X-Men #1.
Oh, okay, yeah, I see your point.
Yeah, because what happens in the Image era, you had during the modern era, as I've been referring to it, you had this idea of designer comics starting up.
Right. That
John Byrne was a big name. He was the first name I can remember them really pushing.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens postmodern is all about marketing. It's all about the name. It has... The comic itself has very little to do with anything anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And X-Men #1, what kind of happened was Chris Claremont had been doing the X-Men for 100 years. It was one of Marvel's consecutive top sellers. It was super popular. A lot of people say it's because one guy wrote it for so long, you could kind of slow burn your stories and build up to them.
And he did. He did all kinds of great stories and sagas with it.
Yep, and then Jim Lee comes along. He starts getting super popular.
Mm-hmm.
He's the artist. He starts getting more and more input. He starts overriding Claremont, and then basically Marvel says, "Nah, it's yours now."
Yep.
And you're
more popular. You're running it, and Claremont's like, "Okay, screw you."
Yeah, and that's where I think the postmodern starts because it's all about name recognition.
Right. Yeah.
And
I can see that. That's the point where it's more about the artist and more about the artist basically.
Yeah.
Than it is actually about the book itself.
Yep. And then that's the era of the marketing gimmick because you've got 15 different hollow foil covers, and if you mail 15 proof of purchases in, you can get this limited edition 0 issue of the story, and
mm-hmm.
And then that was what it was all about. The comics themselves, the content of them was less and less important. It was the name, it was the gimmick, it was the big, it was pouches and cross hatching.
Right, yeah.
You saw that too because basically anyone who could draw like Jim Lee, somebody somewhere would publish your stuff.
Right.
And a lot of like what was left of the independents had either completely almost withdrawn from the industry wholesale. They were sort of their own thing now.
Right.
Or they were busy desperately trying to be Image.
That makes, well, yeah, exactly. Well, Image made a shit ton of money, so of course.
Yeah, and they made it in like no time at all.
Well, yeah, because if I recall right, Wildcats was the first one, if I remember right. Mm-hmm. And it sold like 2 million copies, something like that.
It was, I don't know if, was it 2? I think it might have been 1 million. Because I think officially the X-Men #1 was the first comic in a long time to hit 1 million sales.
Right.
But I think that's just because it had like 50 different covers.
Yes, yeah. Well, they did a whole bunch of little stunts with it and such.
And the speculators were in full bloom at the beginning of this era, so they would buy 8 copies of the 15 different covers that everything had.
Yep, exactly. Let's see. The Wildcats were okay. They were the apex of the speculator boom. 1 million copies for the early issues. So yeah, they were hitting the 1 million mark.
Yeah. So Wildcats #1 comes out a year later. Wildcats #2 comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was the problem with them, right?
Yeah.
They were coming out at a snail's pace. You'd think, we're writing $1 million tickets. We should probably pump them out as fast as we possibly can. No, not really.
Well, and especially because to make the money, they didn't have to. Because
they had to publish.
Yeah, but you'd put one issue out. You'd sell 50 different action figures based on it, 13 sketchbooks. You'd license it out for a movie or a cartoon that may or may not happen. You do guest appearances,
Right. No, there was a Wildcats cartoon. No one remembers it, and it was I think it was horribly animated. But yeah, there was a Wildcats cartoon.
Yeah, there was, and it was kind of, well, because that came out too. Remember, this was the era where animation was in decline.
Oh yeah, exactly.
So when these things would come out, you get this flashy like Image comic with all this super detailed, fussy artwork in it, and that. And cross-hatching everywhere, and then you'd get this cartoon that had no budget.
Right.
So it's just like basically like skeleton frame illustration and that, and I think that's why most of the cartoons didn't really do so well.
Right. Actually, the Wildcats cartoon came out, it was 13 episodes, came out in 94, and was produced by Nelvana.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, if you've ever seen it, well...
Yeah, just go look it up on YouTube. Have fun.
It's one of the 90th things you'll ever see.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is.
They're heroes, not zeros, after all.
Ooh.
But anyway.
Yep. Okay, there we go.
So and then the other thing that happens during this era is this is when Marvel and DC get scared and start buying up all the distributors.
Right, yeah. Because they think okay, what we'll do is we'll just corner the market by owning all the distributors.
Yeah.
But wait, I thought Marvel also was buying distributors too.
They both did, because it was by this point, if I remember correctly, the only 2 left, because in the 80s there were a bunch. There was like 15, 20 comic book distributors for North America.
Right.
I think at this point it was Capital and Diamond was pretty much it.
Okay.
And then, I'm a little fuzzy on this, but Marvel bought one, DC bought the other.
Okay, right. Yep. I remember that, yeah.
And then that kind of, what that did is that created that squeezed everybody else out.
Right.
Because there were other companies that were kind of Image was big, Valiant was big.
Mm-hmm.
Who did the Ultraverse?
Oh, the Ultraverse wasn't that Valiant?
Was it Valiant? I thought, because Valiant had all the old Gold Key heroes.
Fine, I'll check. Ultraverse was Malibu.
Malibu, that's right.
Yeah, there we go, Malibu, yeah.
Yeah, and these guys were basically kind of following the Image formula, and they were starting to get popular too, so they were sort of getting squeezed out of the market, and then what ends up happening is...
Mm-hmm.
If you were a reader at that time, and you kind of, because you can only read so many Batman comics, and then you know what's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there was nothing else free in the comic shops because everybody else was getting squeezed out.
Right.
So when the speculators gave up, because, you know, everybody bought 15 copies of everything and put it away.
Of course they did.
Yeah, that kicked the legs completely out of the North American comic book industry.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I consider the postmodern era ends with...
What would it end with? I don't know. What does it end with?
What is it that the event that kicked the legs out of the North American comic book industry?
It's getting late, man.
Okay. That would be...
What is it?
The death of Superman.
Oh, right. Of course.
Yep.
Yes.
Because it started innocuously enough. They were going to like kill off Superman, and the thing is, again, slow news day, the papers caught wind of it, and it became the big thing.
Yep.
And then all the speculators would buy like 20 copies, and the next month 30 copies, and you'd see the sales going up. Because the only issue that's worth anything anymore, really, is the first Doomsday one, where it's just like his hand crushing a bird. Because Superman's sales were down, there was no hype on this.
Right, yeah.
But then everybody bought, and they had all these events, and the new Superman came out, and then the Return of Superman, and they published tons of them, and everybody put them away, and every comic shop in North America has a basement full of these things. Mm-hmm. And the speculators said, wait, everybody put them away, they're not going to be worth anything, and the bottom just literally overnight dropped.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I worked at a comic shop, and I remember when that started, the book would come in Friday and sell for $5. Saturday, you'd be selling them for 20, and you'd have lineups for them. By like next Wednesday, they'd be 50, but listing at $50.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was quite a heady time.
Yeah, and it was disturbing because you knew the bottom was going to fall out sooner or later because everybody was doing this.
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
Then it did, and then I think that's what led to what I call the postmodern era.
Okay. Where everything is based on events every year, or corrections, every quarter of the year.
Yep.
Where superhero comics are no longer around the story, but they're all just lead-ins to the next big crossover event where you have to buy 20 different books. That era?
Yep, because, what I see happen was when the speculators left, the sales of these books that were selling like 500,000 copies a month and up dropped down to like 200.
Yeah.
And I think that what you were getting at that point was kind of a more realistic indication of readership. Mm-hmm. That these are the people who were following the story. But that sudden collapse scared the hell out of everybody. And what you got was Marvel and DC as the mainstream kind of isolated themselves.
Yep.
They weren't bringing in a new audience, so they've got the same old audience they've had since the 80s. And what the events kind of do is they just swap around the same readers over and over. Mm-hmm. So when DC does their big new event, they'll all buy those for a month or two just to see what's going on. And this is also the era of nerd rage to see how they ruined Spider-Man this time.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, you're talking about A New Day.
Oh, I'm talking about a whole pilot, the Clone Saga, A New Day.
Saga, A New Day, all that stuff,
What was the one with all the different Venoms? Like, there's tons of them.
Oh, I don't remember what that thing was called. Yeah.
Yeah, the Symbiote Saga or something.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, I think you're right. And of course, also, at this point, we're also going to get into the Marvel Ultimate line.
Yep.
Where Marvel basically reboots all of their characters again. And makes them all new, 21st century versions of the characters.
Yeah. And you also...
Which means they don't fight very much and they whine a lot.
But you also had that happening even before, because you had like Marvel 2099, you had Marvel Max, you had DC just rebooting the whole universe every couple of years. And that's what they're doing. They're not bringing anyone in, and that's why I think like people don't care about the comics, even if they love the characters, because if you're a fan from the outside, like the movies, well, the stories are so different that even if you get into it, next year it's going to change up again, so you lose interest.
Yeah, pretty much.
And yeah, it's just the ever diminishing crowd of oldsters that kind of are just jumping back and forth depending on who's got the new thing, because it's a bit of a distraction for a few months, and then you wait for the next one, and then you complain on the internet over and over and over about it. And...
Actually, I think you kind of missed something, though.
Okay.
Marvel actually had a bankruptcy at the end of the 90s, if I remember right, as well.
Right.
And that's the point where Marvel got bought out. I'm trying to remember, not by Disney. This was the company that bought them before Disney.
Oh.
They ended up being bought out, and that's the point, if it wasn't already, where Marvel truly had to start making a profit. Like, they were literally a profit-driven company. And that was part of the thing that was driving the constant stream of crossovers and such, because they were literally trying to make their quarterly profits.
Yeah, and that's the other problem with the events, too, if you're a new fan, is that you can't just read them, because they tie them into, like, 18 other books that you really don't care about.
Yep, pretty much. One good thing, though, that did come out from the postmodern era, though, is the rise of, and this is partly because of Image, is the rise of creator rights.
Yeah.
And also the rise of these semi-independent studios. So you would have all these little, quote-unquote, studios that would pop up. And then they are now being published by, like, IDW and a few others that basically exist to just publish these smaller studios' products.
Yeah.
Like, they basically just pick the best of these smaller studios and then publish them. I think that's awesome.
Well, there's another catch, too, that I think during the postmodern era that happens is because Marvel and DC kind of cornered the market on comic book distribution, a lot of the new stuff that comes out doesn't end up sequestered in the comic shops.
That's true.
That companies like the one everybody would know would be The Walking Dead, that it starts in the comic shops, but they did the compilations that sell in bookstores or online.
Yeah, exactly. And that started in the 2000s, and it definitely was a big influence on things. That you could now literally just publish a comic. In some ways, actually, comics started to be published as a prelude to being collected as a graphic novel and stuck in bookstores. Yeah, where they probably sell even more copies.
Yep, I could see that.
So that became a big part of it.
And I think that was kind of the good that came out of it, because Marvel and DC, when they kind of took over in the 80s, they started contracting their content because they just run towards whatever was working. And then in the 90s, when Image took off, that's what everybody did. And I think when you got to like the postmodern era and the bottom had totally fallen out, anybody who got into comic books at that point did it to get into comic books.
Right.
Whereas especially the 90s, it was a lucrative enough position. People would get into comic books as a way to make money until they become screenwriters or license out their properties and that.
Well, even today, actually, a lot of, especially comic miniseries or graphic novels, especially, are published not to become a comic book series, but as almost a pitch for, to be a movie or whatever. That's still very common. Yeah, it was super common for a while there because Hollywood was buying up every second original graphic novel that came out. They were buying up all the rights left, right, and center.
Yeah, but you're getting people who specifically want to do comics as well, like in greater numbers.
Right.
Especially like, say, nowadays, which I can't think of what comes after postmodern.
We'll call it now.
Now, that works. But when you get to now, even if people are thinking of licensing their property out, they're still doing a comic book.
Right. It's
not, or some of them will be doing, like if you work for IDW, you might be doing like the Lone Ranger now. But you're a comic book artist who's doing the Lone Ranger. You're a comic book writer who's doing the Lone Ranger.
That's true.
And that's sort of a little different, because that was when you had the designer comics of the 90s. You had a lot of these guys that, would become celebrities right away and then just sort of stop producing.
Well, once they made a ton of money.
Yeah, and then it wasn't about doing the books at all. It was about making that ton of money and now I'm done.
Right. I could see that. Well, and but as you said, they were getting into it as a way to make money. Although I think most of them got into it to be comic artists, but just once they made enough money, they're like, this is hard work, and I've just made a ton of money. Why do I have to keep doing it?
Yeah, I think sort of, but I always think back. There's one guy who was he's the son of a friend of my mother's, who actually became like a big cartoonist. And if I said his name, people would know who I'm talking about.
Right.
And talking with him about it back when he was just starting, his whole motivation was, as he put it, it beats getting a real job.
Right. Okay.
And I think there was a lot of that back in that designer era.
Mm.
And that was where you got like the image guys like Todd McFarlane.
Right.
Who I've been told, and I've seen interviews in that kind of lean this way, is like the ego that walks like a man.
Right.
And he did some good stuff, but again, it stopped being about doing comics real quick. Because I think it was like, he did Spawn, and I think it was like by like issue 9, he was already like had other people working on it.
Right.
Because then it became about marketing Todd McFarlane and Todd McFarlane Industries and all that kind of thing.
Right. Okay, so since we're running a little late on time, let's move things forward a bit since we're in the modern era. So what's happened in the last couple of years? Well, a couple things have happened. Marvel and DC have both gone online, which means you can you can subscribe to their websites and read many of their comics, including much of their old library online if you want to, for a monthly subscription, or you can buy them online or however that works. I don't know, but I'm guessing they're producing some original comics just for online. I don't subscribe to either of them, so I can't comment. Right. But they don't think their focus hasn't been there so far anyway.
Yeah.
They've both rebooted their universes, or at least DC has, and I think Marvel has, probably 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years.
Possibly once while we were recording this.
Exactly. Marvel has done having been bought by Disney, has actually moved from New York to LA, or at least California. I believe it's LA, so they can be closer to, Marvel Studios. And rumor has it, that's actually not a rumor, actually. We're getting into a new interesting era, actually, where you were talking about celebrity artists and writers and such. Actually, we're getting into a whole new era of celebrity artists and writers, partly thanks to the focus on comic culture.
Right.
But we're also getting into an era of celebrity artists and writers who can look at their comic book positions and that as a bully pulpit, some would say, for their own agendas.
Right.
Which I'm not saying whether those agendas are good or bad, but let's just say that some of them have strongly taken to using this as a position to pine about social justice issues and such. And okay, they're hired to. Well, one of the things that happened is when they did the move, they lost a lot of the old guard.
Right.
And what I've heard is, at least for Marvel, I don't know about DC. I think DC is still a little more traditional, but basically they replaced most of the old guard male ones with basically young female writers and editors. Which apparently there's a lot of them at the new Marvel, especially young female editors, and that's who we're mostly talking about when I'm saying this.
Right.
And they've basically, they see it as their mission to update the characters. And probably that's what they were told to do, right? I mean, they were told to update the characters. So they're changing them in various ways, which has done a good job from what I've seen of alienating a lot of the older fans. But then again, maybe that's a good thing, actually. Because... no, let me finish for a sec here, okay? One of the Marvel Comics' problems has always been that they're perpetually trying to both please the older fans and bring in new ones, and they're failing at both. Right. That's one of the reasons why Marvel goes bankrupt every 10 years, or has so far. And perhaps maybe this approach that they're taking, where the new editors and writers that are coming in, I can say from what I've seen of their work, a lot of them are much more influenced by anime and manga than the previous generations were. So there's definitely a strong attempt to appeal to a crowd that's grown up with anime and manga, to make to introduce young heroes who are growing in their abilities and learning about what it's like to be a hero, often under the mentorship of some of the the older characters who have now moved into more senior or retired masterly positions and are no longer the focus. And maybe that'll work out for them. I mean, maybe that'll actually be something that brings a new generation in. The only problem with that theory, just to finish things off, is, as I said, I've heard that they're selling on average about only 20,000 copies, which makes it an all-time low. And in fact, there's someone who pointed out that 20,000 copies is actually a fairly standard print run, assuming that they're selling a couple copies to every comic shop across the nation. That would cover 20,000 copies. Yeah. It doesn't mean that anyone is actually reading them. it means that they have it means that the comic shops are buying 20,000 copies. Presumably,
at gunpoint,
they would continue to presumably they wouldn't keep buying them if they weren't able to sell them, but that may or may not be the case. Sorry, continue. Sorry, you had something you wanted to say?
I think you're kind of right. I'm kind of wrong and kind of right.
That's my usual state, dude. That's my usual state. Go ahead.
Yeah, because what you run into, and this is, I do think when you look at, especially Marvel, they're trying to, like, modern up their stuff.
Right.
But I think, because you see all kinds of people that complain mostly about Marvel. Oh my God, they're politically correcting up my comic books. I think a lot of what you're getting is the execs are doing what they did, like, in the 70s. What are the kids into these days? Nah, social justice and not working. Okay, do that, you know. And that's why you get this weird kind of, where are you going?
The only thing is that unlike back in those days, they said, okay, what are the kids into these days? Okay, they're into, like, the hippie stuff. Well, then, generally speaking, they told their, fellow old white guys, do stuff about young Asians or young blacks or whatever, and that's where we get Marvel's Go-Go Checks comics and such. Whereas today, they did the opposite, which maybe was the right way to do it. I have no idea. They hired a whole bunch of young women to do it.
Yeah.
And so who are, 20-somethings and who are actually, kids of today, so to speak.
They did, but the problem that they then run into is the people who would enjoy those books are never going to see them because they don't go into comic book shops.
That's the problem that they've run into.
Yeah,
I've heard Marvel did that announcement just last year, I think, where they said we tried catering to social justice, people, and the people who believe in social justice, who wanted a black Spider-Man and a female Thor and an Asian Hulk and all that, and everyone cheered us on, and there were millions of likes on Facebook, and then nobody bought our books.
Yeah, because nobody goes into it. The only people going to the comic shops are like 40.
And therein lies the problem.
Yeah, because they're not going to enjoy that. They're going to complain that you're raping my childhood. Nerd rage.
Well, like I said, so therefore they managed to get rid of those old fans that were just causing them problems.
But they didn't bring the new ones in. Oops.
Oops. Well, that's there's the downside to everything.
Because I think that's the hang up for your Marvel and DC, is they have to find a way to get out of the comic shops now.
Yes, well, to get back out of them, yeah. But the problem is that there aren't really, from what I know, there aren't really newsstands anymore. I mean, the only way out of the comic shops would be either online, which they're doing. I mean, they could go into the checkout counters at 7-Elevens, I suppose. That kind of thing. That would work. Well, yeah. That's kind of about it.
Because there's. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, there's not that many places to go.
No, and when they go online, what they're doing is, like here, an issue of a Marvel comic costs like $5.
Right.
For me to go download, it's like $4. Well, it's not really.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I imagine. Let's see. DC online. Let's see. I hope I don't. Just gonna quickly. No, I don't want the. There's DC Universe Online. No, that's the role-playing game.
Yeah.
What do they call it? DC Direct, is it?
Oh, I think it might be, yeah.
DC Direct. Let's take a look. Yes, there we go. No, DC Direct is the toys one. Okay. What do they call it? DC Comics? Because I know they both have them. Both Marvel and DC have DC. Okay, just DC Comics. Let's just look at DC Comics. Okay. All right.
I think we're also finding another problem with finding them online.
Well, because the one is okay. We won't worry about that. Okay, comics. Let's take a look. So we're looking at Teen Titans Go. We're looking at Trinity, Hanna-Barbera comics. Yeah, they're doing a whole bunch of Hanna-Barbera comics and such. I mean, but let's see. Where can I find digital comics? Okay, digital comics. There we go. They've got all these digital comics. Okay, let's look at the Teen Titans Omnibus. Okay, let's take a look. And let's say I want to read the Teen Titans Omnibus. Okay, oh wait, this is the one book for sale, $75. Okay, no, I want digital, online, isn't it? Let's browse comics. Maybe that's not online. Okay, I want to read online comic books. Where do I go? Let's see, Bane Conquest. Okay, we'll try that. $3.99 available now. Buy now. Barnes and Noble. Wait. I can buy digital. Amazon and other things. Okay. Is there no subscription service? Do I have to pay? You're right. $4 to buy a comic, to buy a digital copy of a comic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what I have to pay?
And that's the problem, is because an actual copy doesn't cost that much more. So.
Right. Yeah. Why would? Well, I guess it's just convenience. Okay, Marvel Comics. Let's go see, because I know Marvel should have a subscription service. I thought both of them did, but maybe I'm just completely wrong at this point. Marvel.
I thought they did for
Comics?
a while. Anyway, I don't know if they still do, because there were problems with both of them when they first started.
Okay, Marvel Insider. Okay, best-selling digital comics. Free and Marvel. Oh, Marvel Unlimited. That's what it's called. There it is. Marvel Unlimited. Okay, so let's take a look. So, I can read Marvel's M&M's comic.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's see. Marvel. Okay, no, better yet. Let's just go to Marvel Unlimited. Okay, here we go. Access to 200,000 plus digital comics. 20,000 plus digital comics. $9.99 a month.
Mm-hmm. That's not bad.
Or $69 a year, or $69 a year for annual membership, or are they called annual plus? $99 a year, but there's some attachments to it. It comes with a whole lot of extra, including exclusive Eye of Agamotto pin and Wakandan flag patch if you sign up for annual plus. Okay, because I know DC is planning something like that, because they're actually producing like a Teen Titans TV show and a new young season of Young Justice,
right,
specifically to go along with their online service. So I don't know. I thought that they did have their online, their online subscription as well. Okay, wait. Let's try subscription. Oh, there's a Justice League Power Rangers combo. Ooh,
weird.
Something I don't want to read. All right, so. Okay, I'll save that for later. Anyway, I don't know. It looks like, as far as I can tell, I guess DC doesn't have any kind of like online service.
Right.
Not that I can find anyway. Free comics, digital first, top selling. But I'm not seeing anything that looks like the Marvel all-you-can-eat, Netflix subscription model. It seems to be digital first. Maybe that's it. Digital first. They're all like 99 cents a pop.
That's not bad.
So again, they're charging me for them individually. They're not letting me, like all you can eat. Mm-hmm. Which, okay, maybe they're taking different approaches. All right, that's fine. That's, they can do that.
Right.
But so there's the current state of comics, basically. Okay. Apparently I can get all the Marvel comics I want for $9.99 a month, but DC is charging me 99 cents each for a digital copy that I can only read on their site.
Yeah,
or using their browser thingy.
Yeah, that's kind of harsh. But even then, like a buck isn't bad, but you don't get your own digital copy of it, so that's sort of limiting.
Meanwhile, going back to something we said earlier, Archie is still selling a shit ton of books.
Yeah, no kidding. I think at this point, Archie's winning.
I would say so. I mean, at this point, I would almost argue that Archie will probably be in print longer than Batman or Superman. I could actually see that happening. Who knows? There keeps being rumors that at this point that Marvel is literally just going to be shut down. Like that the studio side, because they're not making any money from the comics, are just basically going to shut the comics down.
Right.
And just cancel the whole thing. The only flaw with that plan I could see is I thought that the comics existed to keep the rights to a lot of those characters from falling back into the hands of their creators.
Right.
That's why a lot of these weird characters had to pop up at least once every couple years to basically so that Marvel can keep the rights. If they don't keep them in print, I think at that point, now mind you, a lot of the original creators are either dead or quite old at this point. Mm-hmm. But I think there are some issues that may pop up that they may or may not see coming.
Yeah.
So that would be the one reason why I could possibly see, Marvel and DC still, sticking around for a while, if for no other reason than just act as content factories and maybe occasionally produce some new content that they could, sell in another medium.
Yeah, it could. I think you're gonna tying in with what you're saying. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some kind of relicensing happening.
Right. I can see that.
To that, but yeah, because I don't think part of the problem too with your Marvels or your DCs is they're part of these giant conglomerates.
Mm-hmm.
So the home office probably doesn't care what the comics division does anymore because they're not making any money.
Yeah, that's true. DC's not making much money from the movies either, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's the thing. You get to say Marvel now. I mean, the head of DC, not the head of Disney's probably going, comic books? We still do those? What?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, we're still well, maybe. I mean, they discovered that movie franchises are where it's at. But the problem is that, as we've already pointed out, superheroes are one of those things. I know Jack's going to tease me for this, but they are cyclical.
Yeah.
And even superhero movies are cyclical. Eventually, people are going to get sick of them.
Yeah.
I keep saying that because I know someday it's going to be true. And at that point, it's well, what are they going to do then? I mean, they'll probably just keep producing cartoons for TV or something, because there'll always be a love for these characters, I think, to one form or another.
Yeah, I think you can look at it the other way around, too, though.
Mm-hmm.
That all it really takes is for the comic books to take off again would be for somebody to happen to do something as a comic book for some company, and it takes off.
Right.
Thanks to the Japanese boom from the late 90s, early 2000s, you've got a generation of kids who aren't terrified of comic books, that they don't think a comic book is inherently something weird or geeky or just for kids or that.
Oh no, it's just their common culture now.
Yeah, and all it takes is if one person does that one thing that manages to hit, and you'll see a whole new big boom period, I think.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point to end this on. And hopefully that exact thing will eventually happen.
Could be Archie.
Probably Archie, exactly.
Archie seems to be heading that way.
Well, pretty much. I think in the end, I still think Archie's going to win. All right. Maybe we'll do an episode on Archie, just Archie at some point, I think, just to talk about it. I think that would be fun. Okay, so thanks for listening, folks. I know it's been a long one. I hope this has been somewhat educational. I hope you've enjoyed it. And keep reading comics. That's all I have to say. Or not. It's up to you.
One day Archie will rule all.
Most likely. Good night, folks. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.